The year is 1985. After developing a series of successful arcade games in the early 1980s, Nintendo planned to create a home video game console. Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi called for a simple, cheap console that ran games stored on a cartridge. The Nintendo Entertainment System, more commonly referred to as NES or just Nintendo, is an 8-bit, third-generation home video game console produced by the Nintendo Corporation of Japan. It was first released in 1983 in Japan as the Family Computer, or more commonly known as the Famicom. Today we are exploring the complete video game console Iceberg. We'll take a look at virtually every console ever produced, from the more commonly known Nintendos and PlayStations to some more obscure releases that I bet you've never even heard of. So let's jump right into the water at the top of the iceberg in Tier 1. We'll start things off with the one classic video game console that everyone knows and loves, the Nintendo Entertainment System. Released in North America in October of 1985 at a retail price of $179.99, the NES featured a number of groundbreaking games such as Super Mario Bros. And Excitebike, and action-adventure games such as The Legend of Zelda and Metroid. The controller design was reused from Nintendo's Game & Watch portable gaming device. Nintendo released several add-ons, such as the Power Glove, the Power Pad, and a light gun called the Zapper for shooting games. Nintendo's design styling for its US release was made deliberately different from that of any other game console at the time, using a VCR-style front-loading design. This design works well when both the connector and cartridge are new. However, inserting a cartridge into the NES, the force bends the contact pins slightly, wearing them out over time. This design was also more prone to interference by dust than any other design. The NES's design problems are only made worse by Nintendo's choice of materials used to make the console and cartridges. The console's nickel connector springs wear out over time, and the brass-plated nickel connectors are prone to oxidation. Most players would try to solve these problems by shifting the cartridge side to side inside of the console, or by blowing air into their console and cartridges, but in reality, this only made the oxidation worse due to moisture and wore out the brass pins faster. In 1993, the console was redesigned to a top-loading design to fix these problems, and as part of the final Nintendo release bundle, the product included the new style NES, or model NES-101, and one redesigned dog-bone game controller. This new style NES was produced until it was discontinued in August of 1995. Overall, there were more than 60 million NES consoles sold during its 10-year lifespan, and in 2011, IGN named the Nintendo Entertainment System the greatest video game console of all time. Now let's take a step back from the NES and look at the next console on our list, which has a surprising connection to Nintendo. Sony's first entry into the video game console world, the PlayStation. The PlayStation, commonly known as the PS1 or its codename PSX, is a video game console developed and marketed by Sony Computer Entertainment. It was released in Japan in December of 1994 and in North America, Europe, and Australia in September of 1995. As a fifth-generation console, the PlayStation primarily competed with the Nintendo 64 and the Sega Saturn, but it does have a surprising connection with Nintendo. Sony began developing the PlayStation after a failed business venture with Nintendo to create a CD-ROM drive for the Super Nintendo Entertainment Center in the early 1990s. Nintendo had produced floppy disk technology to complement cartridges for the Famicom system, and wanted to continue this storage system for the SNES. Since Sony was already contracted to produce the sound processor for the SNES, Nintendo contracted Sony to develop a CD-ROM add-on named SNES CD, or the PlayStation. The PlayStation for Nintendo was to be announced at the 1991 Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. However, Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi thought the original 1988 contract was unacceptable because it essentially gave Sony control over all games written on the SNES CD-ROM format. He sent the Nintendo of America president a more favorable contract with the Dutch company called Philips, which was Sony's rival. This contract would give Nintendo total control over their licenses on all Philips-produced disk drives. Sony's director at the time learned of Nintendo's decision only 2 days before the CES show was due to begin, and in fact, on the first day of the CES, Sony announced their partnership with Nintendo and their new console, the PlayStation. At 9 a.m. the next day, In what has been called the greatest ever betrayal in the video game industry, Nintendo revealed that it would now work with Philips instead of Sony. Wanting to distance itself from the failed project with Nintendo, Sony initially branded the PlayStation X or PSX. An emphasis on 3D polygon graphics was placed at the forefront of the console's design. The console proved to be popular for its extensive game library, popular franchises, low retail price, and aggressive youth marketing which advertised it as the preferable console for teens and adults. Popular PlayStation franchises included Gran Turismo, Crash Bandicoot, Tomb Raider, and Final Fantasy, all of which had numerous sequels. The PlayStation signals Sony's rise to power in the video game industry. Its use of compact discs brought on the game industry's transition from cartridges to CDs and DVDs. In 2001, Sony released a smaller and cheaper model, the PS1. More than 28 million PS1 units had been sold by the time it was discontinued in March of 2006. 3 versions of the PlayStation's controller were released over the console's lifespan. The first controller, the PlayStation controller, was released alongside the PlayStation in December of 1994. It features 4 individual directional buttons, a pair of shoulder buttons on both sides, start and select buttons in the center, and 4 face buttons consisting of simple geometric shapes. Rather than using traditional letters or numbers on its buttons, the PlayStation controller used these shapes which would become iconic to the PlayStation brand. The increasing popularity of 3D games prompted Sony to add analog sticks to its controller design to give its users more freedom over their movements in 3D environments. The first official analog controller, the Dual Analog Controller, was revealed at the 1996 PlayStation Expo in Japan. And in November of 1997, Sony introduced the DualShock controller, which gets its name from its 2 vibrating motors. Sony released a series of accessories to add extra functionality to the PlayStation, including memory cards, the PlayStation Mouse, a 4-player link cable, the multiplayer adapter, the memory drive for 3.5-inch floppy disks, and the GunCon light gun. A total of 3,061 PlayStation games have been released worldwide since its release. The PlayStation's best-selling game is Gran Turismo, released in 1997, which sold more than 10 million copies. The Sony PlayStation was discontinued in 2006 with a total of 962 million game copies sold worldwide. With the success of the PlayStation 1, Sony decided there was only one thing to do: make an even better version, the PlayStation 2. PlayStation 2, more commonly called the PS2, was first released in Japan in March of 2000 and the rest of the world later that year. It's the successor to the original PlayStation as well as the second installment in the PlayStation brand of consoles. It's a 6th generation console and competed with Nintendo's GameCube and Microsoft's Xbox. Sony began development for the PlayStation 2 shortly after the release of the PlayStation 1 in 1994 and unveiled it at the Tokyo Game Show in September of 1999. The new PlayStation was being developed to have backwards compatibility with the original PlayStation games, a built-in DVD player, and internet connectivity. The success of the PS2 at the end of 2000 caused Sega problems both financially and competitively, and Sega announced the discontinuation of the Dreamcast in March 2001. The PlayStation 2 was such a powerful console, it essentially put Sega out of the video game business. With one of its biggest competitors out of the way, in May of 2002, Sony cut the price of the console from $299 to $199 in the US, making it the same price as the GameCube and $100 less than the Xbox. Unlike Sega's Dreamcast, Sony originally put very little emphasis on online gaming during its first few years, although that changed with the launch of the online-capable Xbox. Coinciding with the release of Xbox Live, Sony released the PlayStation Network adapter in late 2002. In 2004, in time for the launch of Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, Sony released a smaller, lighter version of the console known as the PS2 Slim. Compared to its predecessor, the Slim line was much smaller, thinner, quieter, and also included a built-in Ethernet port. Even after the release of the PlayStation 3, the PS2 remained popular well into the 7th generation. It continued to be produced until 2013 when Sony finally announced that it had been discontinued after over 12 years in production and one of the longest lifespans of any video game console. A total of over 4,000 game titles were released over the lifetime of the PS2, with over 1.5 billion copies sold. The last game to be released on the PlayStation 2 is Pro Evolution Soccer 2014, which was released in the UK in November of 2013. The PS2 is the best-selling video game console of all time, having sold over 155 million units worldwide. Now we're going to leave Japan for a bit and head over to the United States, where the Microsoft Corporation was developing the Xbox. The original Xbox was manufactured by Microsoft and released in November of 2001. It was the first video game console offered by an American company since the Atari Jaguar stopped sales in 1996. It's classified as a 6th generation console and was competing directly with Sony's PlayStation 2 and Nintendo's GameCube. With the release of the PlayStation 2, which featured the ability to play back CD-ROMs and DVDs in addition to playing games, Microsoft became concerned that game consoles would threaten the personal computer market as an entertainment device. So in 1998, engineers started designing a video game console of their own.
That's fascinating.
Whereas most game consoles to that point were built from custom hardware components, the Xbox was built around standard personal computer components, using variations of Microsoft Windows and DirectX as its operating system to support games and media playback. It featured a 733 MHz Intel Pentium 3 CPU and a 233 MHz NVIDIA GeForce 3 based GPU, making the Xbox more powerful compared to its rivals. The Xbox was the first console to feature a built-in hard drive, and was also built with direct support for broadband connectivity to the internet. And with the release of Xbox Live a year after the console's launch, Microsoft gained an early foothold into online gaming. The Xbox went on to sell over 24 million consoles by the end of its production. The popularity of great game titles such as Halo 2, which became the biggest selling release in history, making over $125 million in its first day, contributed to the popularity of online console gaming, in particular, first-person shooters. The last game released on the original Xbox was Madden NFL 2009 on August 12th of 2008. Since we're already talking about the original Xbox, let's go ahead and talk about its predecessor, the Xbox 360. The Xbox 360 was released as the successor of the original Xbox in November of 2005, competing with Sony's PlayStation 3 and Nintendo's Wii as part of the 7th generation of video game consoles. There was so much hype leading up to the initial launch of the Xbox 360 that it sold out completely when it was released in every region. The Xbox 360 expanded on its already popular Xbox Live service, adding the ability to stream multimedia content from PCs, as well as the ability to purchase and stream music, TV shows, and movies through the Xbox Music and Video Services app. While there had been wireless controllers experimented in the past with RF technology, the Xbox 360 was the first ever video game system to include a Bluetooth wireless controller with the console and not sold as an aftermarket accessory. There was a huge aftermarket accessory market for the Xbox 360, with tons of Microsoft and third-party accessories available, like guitars, gamepads, music turntables, racing wheels, and a lot more. Two major revisions of the Xbox 360 were released following the initial launch. The Xbox 360S, usually referred to as the Xbox Slim, launched in 2010 and featured the same core hardware but with a slimmer form factor and a smaller sized 250 gig hard drive. It also added an integrated Wi-Fi adapter, optical audio output, 5 USB 2.0 ports compared to the 3 from older versions, and a special port designed for the new Microsoft Kinect peripheral. The second major revision of the Xbox 360 was the Xbox 360E, released in 2013. It featured a case style similar to the upcoming Xbox One and eliminated one USB port and the RCA style component and S-video connections, but otherwise shared the same specifications as the Xbox 360S. The most popular game title sold on the Xbox 360 was Grand Theft Auto V, which sold about 23 million copies. Microsoft ended production of the Xbox 360 in 2016 with over 85 million units sold worldwide. Alright, that's enough about Xbox, so let's head back to Japan and talk about Nintendo's next offering in the video game console market, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. The Super Nintendo Entertainment System, more commonly shortened to Super Nintendo, Super NES, or SNES, is a 16-bit video game console developed by Nintendo that was first released in Japan in 1990 and then in North America in 1991. In Japan, it's known as the Super Famicom system. Nintendo released the SNES in America at a price of $199. It launched with very few games, but these games were well received and didn't seem to hurt sales. In Japan, only 2 games were initially available, Super Mario World and F-Zero. In North America, Super Mario World was launched as a bundle with the console, and other launch games included F-Zero, Pilot Wings, and SimCity. The rivalry between Nintendo and Sega was described as one of the most notable console wars in video game history. Sega portrayed the Genesis as the cool console, with games aimed at older audiences, and its aggressive advertisements often attacked its competition. Nintendo, however, had an early advantage by securing the first console version of Capcom's arcade hit Street Fighter II, while this took more than a year to make it to the Sega Genesis. Other popular arcade game conversions, as well as Donkey Kong Country, is said to have helped establish the Super Nintendo in the video game market in the latter years of the 16-bit generation, and maintain competitive sales against the PlayStation and the Sega Saturn. In 1997, Nintendo decided they wanted to offer an SNES console at a lower price point, so they redesigned the Super Nintendo, giving it a smaller, more sleek design and designating the model number SNES-101. This new console was sold for $99 compared to the original price of $199. In order to get the price down, Nintendo removed a few features on the SNES, such as the expansion port on the bottom, the LED power light, the eject button, and the built-in RF modulator. According to Nintendo of America, the company has sold more than 20 million Super Nintendo units in the US. Okay, we've got Nintendo out of the way for now, so let's look at the newest generation of Sony's consoles, the PlayStation 3, 4, and 5. First released in November of 2006 in Japan, the PlayStation 3, better known as the PS3, is a 7th generation gaming console from Sony. It competed with the Microsoft Xbox 360 and the Nintendo Wii and had a price of $599 at launch. The PS3 is the first console in the series to introduce the use of motion sensing technology through its 6-axis wireless controller. The console also incorporates a Blu-ray disc player and features high-definition resolution. The PS3 was originally offered with either a 20GB or 60GB hard drive, but over the years its capacity has increased in increments available up to 500GB. Like its predecessors, the PlayStation 3 was re-released in 2009 as a slim model. The redesigned model is 33% smaller, 36% lighter, and consumes 35 to 45% less power than previous models. Then again in 2012, Sony revealed a newer, super slim PlayStation 3. The new console featured a completely redesigned case that had a sliding door covering the disc drive, which had been moved to the top of the console. Grand Theft Auto V is the best-selling PlayStation 3 game of all time, with over 15 million copies sold, and as of March of 2017, over 87 million PS3s had been sold worldwide. The 8th generation system, the PlayStation 4, or PS4 for short, first launched in November of 2013 with a price of $399 and introduced the x86 architecture to the PlayStation series. Among the new applications and services, Sony introduced the PlayStation app, allowing PS4 owners to turn smartphones and tablets into a second screen to enhance gameplay. Sony also introduced the PlayStation Now game streaming service. 3 years later, in September of 2016, a PlayStation 4 Slim model was unveiled. The new casing is 40% smaller and carries a rounded body with a matte finish on top of the console rather than a two-tone finish. It came with a 500GB internal hard drive at the same price point as the original PS4 model. The best-selling PS4 game to date is Uncharted 4: A Thief's End, with over 15 million copies sold. As of March 2022, over 117 million PlayStation 4s had been sold worldwide. The PlayStation 5, or PS5, was released worldwide in November of 2020 with a price of $599 alongside the Xbox Series X and the Series S, released the same month. It's part of the 9th generation of video game consoles. The console uses an 8-core, 16-thread CPU based on AMD's Zen 2 microarchitecture. The graphics processor is a custom variant of AMD's Navi family using the RDNA microarchitecture, which includes support for hardware acceleration and real-time ray tracing, as well as support for 8K graphics. The system's new controller, the DualSense, has adaptive triggers that can change the resistance to the player as necessary during such actions as operating automobile accelerator and brake pedals or pulling the string on a bow to shoot an arrow. The controller also has a strong haptic feedback system and an improved controller speaker intended to give better in-game feedback. The PlayStation 5 features a completely revamped user interface and is backwards compatible with most PlayStation 4 and VR games. There's even rumors of a PS5 Slim version coming out next year in 2023, so if you're watching this in the future, let me know in the comments if it looks like the one here. Now that we've got Sony out of the way for now, let's talk about their biggest competitor in the video game market, the Xbox One. The Microsoft Xbox One was released in November of 2013 in North America and is the successor to the Xbox 360. The Xbox One competes with Sony's PlayStation 4 and 5 and Nintendo's Wii U and Switch as part of the 8th generation of video game consoles. The Xbox One puts its emphasis on internet-based gaming. It includes the ability to record and stream gameplay and the ability to integrate with your television to watch cable or satellite through the console. It also has a number of apps for a variety of entertainment purposes. Originally, Microsoft bragged about the ability for users to access their game library on any Xbox One console without needing the physical discs, as well as the ability to share their game library with friends and family. However, all games would have to be tied to the user's Xbox Live account, and the console would be required to connect to the internet to play games. After an overwhelmingly negative response from consumers, Microsoft announced that these restrictions would be dropped and the console would not be required to connect to the internet to perform basic functions. But in reality, with most games requiring regular updates or needing to connect to servers to fetch your user information, an internet connection is still almost always required. In April of 2021, Microsoft did remove the Xbox Live requirements for free-to-play games, so you no longer need to pay a monthly Xbox Live subscription fee to play free-to-play games. In June of 2016, Microsoft announced the Xbox One S at E3, which features a smaller form factor as well as support for 4K video, Ultra HD Blu-ray, and HDR. At E3 2017, Microsoft unveiled the Xbox One X, a higher-end model with improved hardware specifications designed to play games at 4K resolution, and in May of 2019, an all-digital version of the Xbox One S was released, eliminating the use of physical discs completely. Microsoft has stated it will not release sales numbers for the Xbox One console, but sales are estimated to be around 50 million units sold worldwide. The fourth generation of Xbox models, which was released in November of 2020, included the Xbox Series S and Series X, are considered members of the ninth generation of video game consoles and were released to compete directly with the PlayStation 5, which was released the same month. The Xbox Series X and Series S are high and low-end versions comparable to the Xbox One X and One S previously mentioned. The Xbox Series X is estimated to be 4 times as powerful as the Xbox One X, with support for 8K resolution and up to 120 frames per second gameplay. In addition to releasing new games for this new generation of Xbox, both consoles are fully compatible with all Xbox One games and most hardware, as well as all backward compatible games that were playable on the Xbox One from the Xbox 360 and original Xbox library. Currently, the Xbox One game with the most sales is Halo 5 Guardians, with about 10 million copies sold. But with the new era of free-to-play microtransactional games, according to Xbox.com, the most played game on the Xbox One consoles are currently Fortnite and Call of Duty Modern Warfare. Okay, that's all of the current Xbox and PlayStation consoles, so let's go back to Nintendo and talk about the last console on Tier 1, the Nintendo Wii. The Wii is a home video game console developed and marketed by Nintendo and released in 2006. It's Nintendo's 5th home game console and is a 7th generation console designed to compete with Microsoft Xbox 360 and Sony PlayStation 3. The primary controller for the Wii is the Wii Remote, a wireless controller with both motion sensing and traditional controls. The Wii was Nintendo's first home console to directly support internet connectivity, supporting both online games and for digital distribution of games and media applications through the Wii Shop channel. The first model of the Wii has Nintendo GameCube memory cards and controller slots to provide backward compatibility. Because of Nintendo's reduced focus on computational power, the Wii and its games were less expensive to produce than its competitors. The Wii was extremely popular at launch, causing the system to be in short supply in most markets. The bundled game Wii Sports was considered the most popular app for the console. Other flagship games included Super Mario, Legends of Zelda, Pokemon, and Metroid. Within a year of launch, the Wii became the best-selling 7th-generation console, and by 2013 had sold over 100 million units, making it Nintendo's best-selling console until it was surpassed by the Nintendo Switch in 2021. The introduction of motion-controlled games via the Wii Remote led both Microsoft and Sony to develop their own competing products, the Xbox Kinect and the PlayStation Move. However, Nintendo found that while the Wii had broadened the demographics they wanted, the core gaming audience had shunned the Wii, opting to game on more powerful consoles with traditional controllers, and the Wii is generally regarded as a children's gaming console. The Wii Mini is a smaller, redesigned Wii with a top-loading disk drive. In addition to the lack of GameCube support, the Wii Mini removes Wi-Fi support and online connectivity, along with the removal of the SD card slot. It also removed support for 480p and component video output. According to Nintendo, they stripped down these features to bring down the price point of the console even further and make it available to those who could not afford an original Wii. The Wii Mini was first released in December of 2012 in the US at a price of $99 and included the Mario Kart Wii game. While the Nintendo Wii was discontinued in 2013, Nintendo continued to produce and market the Wii Mini until 2017. In 2014, the Wii's Wi-Fi services were disabled and online services were discontinued later in 2019. As of 2022, the Wii is the 5th best-selling home console of all time. And there you have it. That's all for Tier 1 of the complete video game console Iceberg. Now it's time to drop down a layer to Tier 2. So let's just get right into it, starting with the oldest model in Tier 2, the Atari 2600. The Atari 2600 is one of the very first home consoles ever produced. It was first released to the public way back in September of 1977 and was produced until 1992. It was one of the very first video game consoles to use a swappable cartridge to store games. Originally called the Atari Video Computer System, or VCS, it came with 2 joystick-style controllers, a pair of paddle controllers, and 1 game cartridge. At the launch of the console in 1977, only 9 games were available. Initial versions came with the game Combat and was later replaced by the more popular Pac-Man. The Atari 2600 sold for a whopping $199, which is equivalent to about $900 today, accounting for inflation. The first smash hit game for the Atari VCS was Space Invaders, released in 1980. The VCS was so popular it spawned the founding of Activision Games and other popular game developers still around today. In 1982, Atari released a programmable version of the VCS called the Atari 5200, which we'll talk about later, and in order to simplify things, they rebranded the original Atari Video Computer System, the Atari 2600, which came from the manufacturer's part number CX2600. But by the end of 1982, the Atari 2600 started to suffer from poorly made games that were rushed to market to make the holiday release in time for Christmas. The most notable of these games was E.T. the Extraterrestrial that was so poorly made it was literally almost unplayable. Hundreds, if not even thousands, of these game cartridges were destroyed and sent to landfills. This, along with newer and better video game consoles being developed in 1983, such as the Nintendo Entertainment System, meant the end for the Atari 2600. By the mid-80s, it was thought of as more of a novelty system compared to the newer, more advanced consoles, and after 14 years on the market, the Atari 2600 was discontinued in 1992. It's estimated to have sold over 20 million consoles worldwide during its lifespan. And that's the brief history of the Atari 2600. Now let's move on to the next console in our list, the Sega Genesis. The Sega Genesis, known as the Mega Drive outside of the US, is a 16-bit 4th-generation video game console developed by Sega. It was their 3rd console and successor to the Master System, which we'll talk about later. The Sega Genesis was first released in 1988 in Japan and then in 1989 in North America. In Japan, the Mega Drive sold very poorly compared to its competition, Nintendo's Super Famicom and NEC's PC Engine. But in America, the Genesis sold fairly well. Contributing to its success was a large game library of over 900 games and the very popular Sonic the Hedgehog, which later became the console's mascot. In 1991, the release of the Super Nintendo started a fierce rivalry between Sega and Nintendo in what came to be known as the Console Wars. Sega sought to get a contract deal with video game publisher
EA Sports. What's in the game?
And the vast game library of impressive games, as well as securing sports licenses for most American sports, helped Sega maintain a 60% market share for total video games sold in the early 90s. With the help of these licensed games, over 30 million Sega Genesis consoles were sold worldwide. Ushering in the era of 32-bit gaming consoles, Sega released two 32-bit add-ons for the Genesis. The first was a CD drive called the Sega CD in the US and Mega CD in Japan. They also introduced a 32-bit cartridge add-on called the 32X. The more popular Sega CD was released in 1991 and about 2.2 million units were sold. The Sega 32X was released in 1994 and only sold about 600,000 units before the Genesis as a whole was discontinued. While we're already on the subject of Sega, let's talk about the next generation console after the Genesis, the Sega Saturn. The Sega Saturn was released in 1995 as part of the fifth generation of video game consoles. It features a dual CPU architecture and 8 processors. Its games are in CD-ROM format, and its game library contains several ports of arcade games as well as original games. Development for the Sega Saturn began in 1992, around the same time the Sega CD and 32X were produced, which was just a temporary fix until the new 32-bit console could be released. The Saturn was initially successful in Japan, but it failed to do well in the US due to the rise of popularity of Nintendo 64. The Sega Saturn is considered to be a commercial failure. The cancellation of Sonic Extreme, planned as the first 3D game in Sega's popular Sonic the Hedgehog series, is considered a major factor in its demise. Having only sold 9 million consoles worldwide, the Sega Saturn was short-lived and was discontinued after only 3 years in 1998. Now let's talk about what's widely being considered the greatest video game console of all time, the Japanese version of the NES, the Famicom. Nintendo's Family Computer, or more simply known as the Famicom, is the Japanese version of the NES. It was released in Japan a full 2 years before the NES was released in the US. The Famicom was one of the best video game consoles ever made and single-handedly saved the game industry following the video game crash of 1983. Original plans called for an advanced 16-bit system which would function as a full-fledged computer with a keyboard and floppy disk drive, but Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi rejected this and instead decided to go for a cheaper cartridge-based game console, as he believed that features such as keyboards and discs were intimidating to the average user. Early Famicom games were written on a system that ran on an NEC PC 8001 computer, and LEDs on a grid were used with a digitizer to design graphics, as no software design tools for this purpose existed at the time. The Famicom was also influenced by the ColecoVision and Coleco's competition against the Atari 2600 in the United States. The ColecoVision's top seller was a port of Nintendo's Donkey Kong, so Nintendo took a Donkey Kong arcade cabinet to chip manufacturer Ryko for analysis, which led to Ryko producing the Picture Processing Unit, or PPU chip, for the NES. The controllers are hardwired to the console with no connectors for cost reasons. The console was released on July 15, 1983, as the home cassette-type video game family computer, with 3 ports of Nintendo's successful arcade games Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr., and Popeye. The cost when it was released was 14,800 yen, which is equivalent to about $140 today, accounting for inflation. The Famicom was produced all the way up until 2003 when it was finally discontinued, along with the Super Famicom, which we'll talk about next. The Super Famicom, or Super Family Computer, is the Japanese version of the Super Nintendo. Originally released in 1990, a year before the SNES was released in the US, the Super Famicom system is a 16-bit video game console and Nintendo's second home console following the success of the Famicom system. The Super Famicom was released in Japan in November of 1990 for 25,000 yen, which is equivalent to about $200 today, accounting for inflation. Nintendo's initial shipment of 300,000 units sold out within hours, and the resulting social disturbance led the Japanese government to ask video game manufacturers to schedule all future console releases only on the weekends. The Super Famicom received positive reviews and was a global success, becoming the best-selling console of the 16-bit era, even after launching relatively late and facing intense competition from the Sega Genesis in North America. To ensure only quality games made it to their consoles, Nintendo had to approve every single game made for the Super Famicom system and SNES, and each third-party developer could only release up to 5 games per year, and those games could not be released on any other console within 2 years. This helped Nintendo maintain a stream of only quality games for its consoles. In 1997, Nintendo released a slimmer version called the Super Famicom Junior. It is comparable to the SNES-101 released in America and had some of its less important features removed so it could be released at a lower price point. The Super Famicom remained popular well into the 32-bit era, with almost 50 million units sold worldwide by this time. It was discontinued in 2003, and it continues to be popular among collectors and retro gamers to this day. Sticking with Nintendo, let's talk about their next console, which brought them into the 64-bit era of gaming, the Nintendo 64. The Nintendo 64, more commonly referred to as the N64, was a successor to the Super Nintendo. Released in 1996, the N64 is a 5th-generation gaming console. It was the last major home gaming console to use cartridges as its primary storage format until the Nintendo Switch in 2017. It competed primarily with the Sony PlayStation and the Sega Saturn. The N64 was named after its 64-bit CPU, which aided in the console's 3D capabilities. The charcoal gray console was followed by a series of color variants. Its design was mostly complete by 1995, but its release was delayed until 1996 for the completion of launch games Super Mario 64 and Pilotwings 64. The controller of the Nintendo 64 is designed in an M shape and features 10 buttons, 1 analog control stick, and a directional pad. The Nintendo 64 is one of the first gaming consoles to have 4 controller ports. According to Shigeru Miyamoto, Nintendo opted to have 4 controller ports because the Nintendo 64 is the company's first console which can handle a 4-player split screen without significant slowdown. Nintendo later released a peripheral platform called 64DD, where DD stands for disk drive. Connecting to the expansion slot at the bottom of the system, the 64DD turns the Nintendo 64 console into an internet appliance, a multimedia workstation, and an expanded gaming platform. This large peripheral allows players to play Nintendo 64-based games, capture images from external video sources, and it allows players to connect to now-defunct Japanese RANnet online services. Time magazine named it Machine of the Year in 1996, and in 2011, IGN named it the 9th greatest video game console of all time. Super Mario 64, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, and GoldenEye 007 are widely considered by critics and the public to be 3 of the greatest and most influential games of all time. The Nintendo 64 was discontinued in 2002 following the 2001 launch of its successor, the GameCube. The N64 was critically acclaimed and remains one of the most recognized video game consoles of all time, selling over 32 million consoles worldwide. The next console in Nintendo's lineup brought an end to an era of cartridge games and began using the new standard media for gaming, the compact disc. The Nintendo GameCube was released in 2001. It is part of the 6th generation of video game consoles and it's a successor to the Nintendo 64. The GameCube competed directly with the PlayStation 2 and the original Xbox. The GameCube was Nintendo's first console to use optical discs rather than cartridges. Some of its most popular games included classic video game titles like Super Smash Bros., Mario Kart Double Dash, and The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. Unlike its competitors, it is solely focused on gaming and does not play mass media like DVDs or CDs. The console supports limited online gaming for only a few games via the GameCube broadband adapter, and it can connect to a Game Boy Advance with a link cable. Nintendo learned from its experiences, both positive and negative, with the Nintendo 64's 3-handle controller design, and chose a more conventional 2-handed design for the GameCube. In 2002, Nintendo introduced the Wavebird wireless controller, the first wireless gamepad developed by a first-party console manufacturer. The RF-based wireless controller is similar in design to the standard controller and communicates with the GameCube with a wireless receiver. Since the Nintendo GameCube cannot play DVDs, Panasonic and Nintendo worked together to create a new version of the console called the Panasonic Q. The Panasonic Q is a hybrid of the Nintendo GameCube and a DVD player and was only released in Japan in 2001. Less than 100,000 units were made, and in December of 2002, the Panasonic Q was discontinued due to poor sales. The main reason being that it was usually less expensive to just buy a Nintendo GameCube and a DVD player separately. The Panasonic Q costs $439 new, which is about $800 today adjusted for inflation. Reception of the GameCube was mixed. It was praised for its controller and extensive library of high-quality games, but was criticized for its exterior design and lack of multimedia features. Nintendo sold 222 million GameCube units worldwide, which was much fewer than they anticipated, and it was later discontinued in 2007. Let's step away from Nintendo for a bit and talk about one of their competitors in the 32-bit video game era, the Sega Dreamcast. Released in 1999, the Sega Dreamcast was the first 6th generation console made. It preceded Sony's PlayStation 2, Nintendo's GameCube, and Microsoft's Xbox, and was Sega's final console, ending the company's 18 years in the console market. One of the biggest problems with the Sega Genesis and Sega Saturn was its complex dual CPU architecture that made it much more difficult to program games for. Knowing the Saturn had been set back by its high production costs and complex hardware, Sega took a different approach with the Dreamcast. In contrast to the expensive hardware of the unsuccessful Saturn, the Dreamcast was designed to reduce costs with off-the-shelf components, including a Hitachi CPU and NEC GPU. Sega also used the GD-ROM media format to avoid the expenses of DVD-ROM technology and a custom version of Windows CE operating system to make porting PC games easy. Despite its short lifespan and limited third-party support, reviewers have celebrated the Dreamcast as one of the greatest consoles ever made. It is considered ahead of its time for pioneering concepts such as online play and downloadable content. Many of its games are considered innovative for the time, including Crazy Taxi, Jet Set Radio, Phantasy Star Online, and Sonic Adventures. The Dreamcast was also the first console to include a built-in modem for internet access and online play. The Dreamcast was offered in a few limited edition models, including an all-black sports model and the Driver's 2000 CX-1, a special edition that had a built-in television set. Though the Dreamcast was somewhat successful, Sony held 60% of the overall game market share in North America with the PlayStation. By the end of 1999, Sega was actually losing money producing the Dreamcast and would need to sell at least 5 million units to keep the company alive. The Dreamcast only ended up selling 3 million units that year, bringing an end to Sega in the video game market by 2001. With only 9 million Sega Dreamcast consoles sold worldwide over the 3 years it was produced, poor sales and negative earnings 5 years in a row forced the company to shut down video game console sales completely. The Sega Dreamcast would be the last console Sega ever made. Now that Sega has officially left the video game console market, let's talk about the last console on Tier 2, Nintendo's Wii U. The Wii U was first released in 2012 and is the first 8th generation video game console. It was built to compete with the Microsoft Xbox One and the Sony PlayStation 4. The primary controller is the Wii U gamepad, which features a touchscreen display similar to portable gaming devices, as well as traditional buttons and analog sticks. The screen can be used with some games to play directly on the controller, eliminating the need for an external display completely. It has a 1.24 GHz tri-core IBM processor, 8 GB of storage for the standard model priced at $299, and 32 GB of storage for the deluxe set, which was priced at $350. Response to the release of the Wii U were mixed. It was praised for its innovative gamepad controller and its improvements over the original Wii. However, it was criticized for its poor user interface and short battery life. In March of 2017, Nintendo released the Switch handheld, which eliminated the need for the Wii U in the market, and it was discontinued that same year. Online support for the Wii U will end in late 2023. The best-selling game for the Wii U is Mario Kart 8 with 8.5 million copies sold, and during its 4-year lifespan, over 13 million Wii U consoles were sold worldwide. That's all for Tier 2, so let's just get right into Tier 3, starting with the oldest model on the list, the Intellivision. The Intellivision is a video game console released by Mattel Electronics in 1979. The name is a mix of the words intelligent and television. Development began in 1977, the same year as the launch of its main competitor, the Atari 2600. It was Mattel's only video game console made until the 2006 failure known as the Hyperscan. The Intellivision was introduced at the 1979 Las Vegas Consumer Electronics Show as a modular home computer with an optional keyboard. Initially said to be priced at $179, it was later released at $250, which is over $1,000 today adjusted for inflation. The Intellivision was branded and distributed by various companies. Before Mattel moved manufacturing to Hong Kong, Intellivision consoles are manufactured by GTE Sylvania, and the only difference was the brand name. The Sears Super Video Arcade was manufactured by Mattel in Hong Kong and has a restyled beige top cover and had detachable controllers. In 1982, Radio Shack marketed the Tandyvision 1, similar to the original console, but with gold plates replaced with more wood trim. In Japan, Intellivision consoles were branded by Bandai, and in Brazil, they were Digimed and Digiplay consoles manufactured by Sharp. Initially, the Intellivision had 19 different game cartridges produced before Christmas of 1980. Most of the early games were based on traditional real-world concepts such as sports, with an emphasis on realism and depth of play within the technology of the time. One example is the golf games, where other consoles' games have a blip sound and crude graphics. The Intellivision features a realistic swing sound and striking of the ball, and a more 3D look. The Intellivision was designed as a modular home computer, so from the beginning, its packaging, promotional materials, and television commercials all promise the addition of an upcoming accessory called the keyboard component. The keyboard component adds an 8-bit processor, making the Intellivision a dual processing computer. In late 1981, design changes were finally implemented and the keyboard component was released at $600 or equivalent to about $2,000 today accounting for inflation. The keyboard was only released in Seattle and New Orleans. In the spring of 1983, Mattel introduced the Intellivision 2, a cheaper, more compact redesign of the original that was to be less expensive to manufacture and service and with updated styling. It also had longer controller cords. One functional difference was the addition of the System Changer, an accessory that played Atari 2600 cartridges through the Intellivision. To make the system work with original Intellivision consoles, a hardware modification was required, which was provided by Mattel. In 1982, with new machines being introduced by its competitors, Mattel wanted to bring an updated system to market. The Intellivision 3 was to be an upgraded but backwards compatible system to the original, however, it never made it past the prototype stage. In 1984, Mattel sold the Intellivision business, and over the 3-year lifespan of the console, a little over 3 million units were sold worldwide. One of Intellivision's biggest competitors in the early 1980 video game market was the next console on our list, the ColecoVision. ColecoVision is a second-generation home video game console developed by Coleco and launched in North America in 1982. The console offered a more powerful arcade video game experience compared to its competitors such as the Atari 2600 and Intellivision. The initial catalog of 12 games included the first home version of Nintendo's Donkey Kong. Approximately 136 games were published between 1982 and 1984. Coleco released a wide variety of hardware add-ons and special controllers to expand the capabilities of the console. Expansion Module 1 allows the system to play Atari 2600 games. Expansion Module 2 is a driving controller with steering wheel and gas pedal that came packaged with the cartridge turbo. Expansion Module 3 converts the ColecoVision into an Atom computer complete with keyboard, data cassette, 64 kilobytes of RAM, and a printer. And the Super Action controller set is a set of 2 handheld joystick controllers that came packaged with the cartridge Super Action Baseball. Masayuki Yumura, head of Famicom development for Nintendo, stated that the ColecoVision set the bar that influenced how he approached the creation of the Famicom system. During the creation of the Nintendo Entertainment System, Takao Sawano, chief manager of the project, brought a ColecoVision home to his family, who were impressed by the system's capability to produce smooth graphics. However, even with its successes, by the beginning of 1984, sales of the ColecoVision had dropped dramatically, and by 1985, ColecoVision was discontinued and Coleco withdrew from the video game market completely. Just over 2 million ColecoVision game consoles were sold worldwide. The next console on our list was another competitor to both the Intellivision and the ColecoVision in the early 1980s, the Atari 5200.
Welcome.
The Atari 5200 Super System, or simply Atari 5200, is a home video game console introduced in 1982 by Atari to compete primarily with Mattel's Intellivision. It was a higher-end programmable version of the Atari Video Computer System. The Atari VCS was renamed to the Atari 2600 at the time of the 5200's launch. While the ColecoVision shipped with the first home version of Nintendo's Donkey Kong, the Atari 5200 included the 1978 arcade game Super Breakout, which had already appeared on the Atari 8-bit family and Atari VCS in 1979 and 1981 respectively. The CPU, graphics, and sound hardware are all almost identical to that of the Atari 8-bit computers of the time, although software is not directly compatible between the two systems. The 5200's controllers have an analog joystick and a numeric keypad along with a start, pause, and reset buttons. The 360-degree joystick was praised as offering more control than that of the 8-way Atari CX40 joystick from the 2600, but was also a focal point for criticism. On May 21, 1984, during a press conference at which the Atari 7800 was introduced, company executives revealed that the 5200 had been discontinued after just 2 years on the market. Total sales of the 5200 were reportedly around 1 million units, far short of the 2600 sales of over 30 million. And that's the very short history of the Atari 5200, and now we'll talk about its predecessor, the Atari 7800. The Atari 7800 Pro System, or simply the Atari 7800, is a home video game console officially released by Atari Corporation in 1986 as a successor to both the Atari 2600 and the Atari 5200. The original cost was $79, which is equivalent to about $220 today, accounting for inflation. It can run almost all Atari 2600 cartridges, making it one of the first consoles with backwards compatibility. The North American version of the 7800 came with a joystick-style controller somewhat similar to that of the 2600, and the European console came with a more traditional button-style controller. Most of the games released at launch were simply just ports of 1981 to 1983 arcade games, and Pole Position 2 was the pack-in game that came with the console. The 7800 has significantly improved graphics hardware over Atari's previous consoles, but the same television interface adapter chip that launched with the 2600 in 1977 is used for audio. In an effort to prevent the flood of poor-quality games that contributed to the video game crash of 1983, all Atari game cartridges for the 7800 had to be digitally signed and approved by Atari. While the system can play the over 400 games for the Atari 2600, there were only 59 official releases for the 7800. The lineup emphasized high-quality versions of games from the golden age of video arcade games, such as Pole Position 2, Dig Dug, and Galaga. But by the time of the 1986 launch of the 7800, these games were 3, 4, and even 5 years old. On January 1, 1992, the Atari Corporation announced the end of production and support for the 7800, 2600, and the 8-bit computer family, including the Atari ZEGs. By the time of the discontinuation, the Nintendo Entertainment System controlled 80% of the North American video game market, while Atari only had about 12%. By the end of its 6-year lifespan, the Atari 7800 had only sold about 1 million consoles. Alright, let's jump ahead a few years and take a look at the next console on our list, the Sega Master System. The Sega Master System is an 8-bit, third-generation home video game console manufactured by Sega. It was originally a remodeled version of the Sega Mark III, the third iteration of the SG-1000 series of consoles. The Master System was released in Japan in 1985, North America in 1986, Europe in 1987, and then Brazil and Korea in 1989. The Master System 2, a cheaper model, was released in 1990 in North America, Australasia, and Europe. The original Master System models used both cartridges and a credit card size format known as Sega cards. Accessories for the consoles include a light gun and 3D glasses that work with a range of specially designed games. The later Master System 2 redesign removed the card slot, turning it into a strictly cartridge-only system and is incompatible with the 3D glasses. The Master System was released in competition with the Nintendo Entertainment System. Its library is smaller and with fewer well-received games than the NES, due in part to Nintendo's licensing policies requiring platform exclusivity. Though the Master System had newer, improved hardware, it failed to overturn Nintendo's significant market share advantage in Japan and North America. Different Master System consoles included built-in games such as Snail Maze, Hang On, Alex Kidd in the Miracle World, and Sonic. In total, the Master System had just over 100 games, and the final North American release was Sonic the Hedgehog in October of 1991. The Sega Master System is estimated to have sold between 10 and 13 million units worldwide. In addition, Tectoy has sold 8 million licensed Master System variants in Brazil. Criticism over the Master System led directly to development of the Sega Genesis. Now let's talk about a new company's entry onto the video game console Iceberg, made by NEC, the PC Engine Super Graphics. The PC Engine Super Graphics, also known as simply the Super Graphics, is a 4th-generation home video game console manufactured by NEC Home Electronics and released in Japan in 1989. Compared to the original PC Engine, the Super Graphics has 4 times the amount of RAM for the main CPU, The SuperGrafx has support for 2 independently scrolling background layers like the Sega Mega Drive, as opposed to the PC Engine's single layer. Since the SuperGrafx was produced and marketed as an upgraded PC Engine model rather than a new platform, it was backwards compatible with standard PC Engine hue cards, in addition to its own. However, SuperGrafx specific hue cards were expensive compared to standard hue cards, and in some cases as much as $100 USD at retail, which is over $250 today accounting for inflation, just for a single game. The SuperGrafx is compatible with the CD-ROM and Super CD-ROM system add-ons, allowing it to play any CD-ROM format game with the required system card. However, no new SuperGrafx specific CD-ROM titles were produced for the SuperGrafx, so you were only able to play older games. The console was rushed to market, released several months before its initial release date in 1990, and it only had minimal updates to the original hardware. With only 6 retail games that took advantage of the console hardware updates, and due to the incredibly high cost of the console and games, the SuperGrafx was a commercial failure, selling only 75,000 units total worldwide. None of the hardware advancements it possessed were carried over to the NEC's later consoles, such as the Turbo Duo. Keeping with the early 1990s, let's go back to the Atari Corporation and talk about one of their more recent video game consoles, the Jaguar. The Atari Jaguar is a home video game console developed by the Atari Corporation and released in North America in 1993. Part of the 5th generation of video game consoles, it competed with the 16-bit Sega Genesis, the Super Nintendo, and the 32-bit 3DO Interactive. Powered by 2 custom 32-bit processors named Tom and Jerry, Atari marketed it as the world's first 64-bit gaming system. Atari tried to downplay its competition by saying the Jaguar was the only true 64-bit gaming system. Atari's reasoning is that the 32-bit Tom and Jerry chips worked in tandem to add up to 64 bits. This claim was ridiculed by Electronic Gaming Monthly that commented that if Sega did the math for the Sega Saturn the way Atari did math for their 64-bit Jaguar, the Sega Saturn would be a 112-bit monster of a machine. The original 1993 cost of the console was $250, which is just over $500 today accounting for inflation. In early 1995, Atari announced that they had dropped the price of the Jaguar to $150 in order to be more competitive. Atari ran infomercials with enthusiastic salesmen touting the game system. These aired for most of 1995, but did little to improve the sales of the Atari Jaguar system. Atari attempted to extend the lifespan of the system with the Atari Jaguar CD add-on, with an additional 13 games, and emphasizing the Jaguar's price of $100 less than its competitors. But with the release of the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation in 1995, sales of the Jaguar continued to fall. It sold no more than 150,000 consoles before it was discontinued in 1996. The commercial failure of the Jaguar prompted Atari to leave the console market completely. In 1998, Hasbro Interactive acquired all Atari Corporation properties. The patents for the Jaguar released into the public domain, and the console was declared an open platform. Since its discontinuation, hobbyists have produced games for the system to this day. Staying in the early 1990s and rounding out the last console in Tier 3, let's talk about the 3DO Interactive Multiplayer. The 3DO Interactive Multiplayer, also referred to as just the 3DO system or simply 3DO, is a home video game console developed by the 3DO company and produced by Panasonic. Released in 1993, the console received mostly negative reviews despite having highly promoted release, as well as some cutting-edge technology for the time. An oversaturated video game console market prevented the system from having success compared to the consoles made by Sony and Sega. The 3DO company lacked the resources to manufacture consoles, and instead licensed the hardware to other companies for manufacturing. Licensing its components to independent manufacturers made the system extremely expensive. The manufacturers had to make a profit on the hardware itself, whereas most video game console manufacturers such as Sony and Sega sold their consoles at a loss, with expectation of making up for the loss with video game sales. With 3DO, this really wasn't possible. In 1993, the 3DO was priced at $699, which is equivalent to more than $1,300 today accounting for inflation, far more expensive than competing game systems. Also, during its production, the 3DO was made by a number of different manufacturers and had a variety of case designs. Some of these include the Panasonic FZ10, the Sanyo 3DO Tri, the Gold Star 3DO Interactive, and the Gold Star 3DO Alive 2, which was only sold in South Korea. By 1996, the 3DO saw almost no increase in sales, and by 1997, the company was sold to Samsung. Samsung would continue to sell the 3DO through 1998 exclusively in South Korea. But with only 2 million consoles sold worldwide in the entire 6-year lifespan of the console, it was finally discontinued in 1999. That's all for Tier 3 of the complete video game console Iceberg, so let's get right into Tier 4, starting with the oldest model on the list, the Magnavox Odyssey. The Magnavox Odyssey is the first commercial home video game console ever made. Magnavox completed development and released it in the United States in September of 1972 and overseas the following year. The Odyssey consists of a white, black, and brown box that connects to a television set and 2 rectangular controllers attached by wires. It's capable of displaying 3 square dots and 1 line of varying height on the screen in black and white. Players place plastic overlays on the screen to display additional visual elements for each game, and players control their dots with knobs and buttons on the controller. The gameplay is very primitive, and the console cannot play audio or track scores. The Odyssey console came packaged with dice, paper money, and other board game type objects to accompany the video games. It also had the first video game light gun, which was sold separately. The idea for a video game console was conceived by Ralph H. Baer in August of 1966. Over the next 3 years, he, along with Bill Harrison and Bill Rush, created 7 successive prototype consoles. The 7th, known as the Brown Box, was shown to several manufacturers before Magnavox agreed to produce it in 1971. After releasing the console through their dealerships, Magnavox sold 69,000 units in its first year and 350,000 units by the time the console was discontinued in 1975. One of the 28 games made for the system, a ping-pong-style game, was an inspiration for Atari's successful 1972 arcade game, Pong. And that leads us to its successor, the Magnavox Odyssey 2. The Magnavox Odyssey 2, also known as Philips Odyssey 2, is a second-generation home video game console that was released in 1978. The Odyssey 2 was one of the 4 major home consoles prior to the 1983 video game market crash, along with the Atari 2600, the Intellivision, and ColecoVision. The original Odyssey had a number of removable circuit cards that switched between the built-in games. With the Odyssey 2, each game could be a unique experience with its own background graphics, foreground graphics, gameplay, scoring, and music. It had 64 bytes of RAM, 1 megabyte of ROM, 16 colors, and a 100 by 200 screen resolution. The Odyssey 2 used a standard joystick design of the 1970s and early 80s. The original console had a big silver controller held in one hand with a square housing for its 8-direction stick that was controlled with the other hand. Later releases had a similar black controller with an 8-pointed star-shaped housing for its directional joystick. And the upper corner of the joystick was a single action button, silver on the original controllers and red on the black controller. One of the strongest points of the system was its speech synthesis unit, which was released as an add-on for speech, music, and sound effects enhancement. The area that the Odyssey 2 may be best remembered for was its pioneering fusion of board and video games, the Master Strategy series. The first game released was Quest for the Rings, with gameplay somewhat similar to Dungeons & Dragons and a storyline reminiscent of The Lord of the Rings. The Magnavox Odyssey 2 was produced for a total of 6 years and sold about 2 million consoles worldwide during that time. And that's the brief history of the Magnavox Odyssey consoles. At around the time the Odyssey was leaving, a new company was entering the home video game market, known as Sega. The SG-1000 is a video game console manufactured by Sega. It was Sega's first entry into the home video game console business. Developed in response to a drop in arcade cabinet sales starting in 1982, the SG-1000 was created at the advice of Hayao Nakayama, president of Sega's Japanese division, and was released on July 15, 1983, the same day Nintendo released the family computer in Japan. The SG-1000 was released in several forms, including the SC-3000 computer and the redesigned SG-1002 released in 1984. The SG-1000 and the SC-3000 both support a library of 76 ROM cartridge games and 29 Sega MyCard games. It has a 3.58 MHz CPU, 1 KB of RAM, and 256 by 192 screen resolution with 16 colors. A third version of the console, the Sega Mark III, was released in 1985. It had a better video display processor over previous version and was the basis for the Sega Master System that was later released in 1986. All SG-1000 games are fully compatible with the Mark III and the Japanese version of the Master System. By 1984, the Nintendo Famicom began to outsell the Sega SG-1000. The Famicom had more advanced hardware that allowed it to perform smoother scrolling, and it had much more colorful sprites. Nintendo also collaborated with a wide variety of third-party game developers, whereas Sega refused to do business with the same companies they were competing with in the stand-up arcade business. The last game cartridge release for the SG-1000 was Portrait of Loretta in February of 1987. In the 2-year lifespan of the console, about 2 million units were sold worldwide. Okay, that's enough about Sega for now, and we're going back to Nintendo to talk about a couple ultra-rare consoles that were released only in Japan. The first one is known as the Twin Famicom. The Twin Famicom is a video game console produced by Sharp and licensed by Nintendo. It was exclusively released in Japan in July of 1986 at a price of 32,000 yen, which converts to about $600 today, accounting for inflation. The Twin Famicom is a licensed Nintendo product that combines the Famicom and the Famicom Disk System into a single console. The Twin Famicom features a 1.79 MHz Ricoh CPU, 32 KB of working RAM, and 8 KB of video RAM. It ran at 256 by 240 resolution with 25 colors and could display 64 sprites on screen at once. While the standard Famicom only had one color combination, the Twin Famicom was sold in two colors, red with black highlights, model AN500R, and black with red highlights, model AN500B. A second version of the system was later released in 1987 with a slightly different case design, turbo controllers, and two different color schemes, black with green highlights, model AN505BK, and red with beige highlights, model AN505RD. The Twin Famicom included a slot for Famicom cartridges, a slot for the disk system floppy disks called disk cards, and a switch located right below the cartridge slot to switch between the two formats. Also on the front are a power button, a reset button, an eject button, and in the back of the console it had slots for controller storage. On the side of the console are a few expansion ports. Port A is the same as other Famicom models and allows the connection of peripherals, but the other ports have no use, as there is no peripherals known that can connect to them. Perhaps they were just planning for the future and no peripherals were made. Sales figures for the Twin Famicom system are unknown. Alright, let's get right into another Japanese exclusive console, which was released just after the Twin Famicom, the Famicom Titler. The Famicom Titler, also known as the Famicom Editor, is a Famicom-based video game console produced by Sharp Corporation in 1989. It was the successor to the Twin Famicom and their second console officially licensed by Nintendo. The console was released exclusively in Japan at a retail price of 43,000 yen, which converts to about $720 today, accounting for inflation. The Famicom Editor was the most technologically advanced project that Sharp had attempted with the Famicom system. The goal for the Famicom Editor was to capture game footage directly from the Famicom itself so it could be edited, at a time when doing so for any video game required specialized equipment. The system additionally features a keyboard and pressure-sensitive touchpad, enabling users to produce subtitles directly on the screen during gameplay and perform other basic editing functions. It also has a microphone to enable video narration. The Famicom Titler is one of the more obscure Nintendo consoles, but it's sought by collectors today, not only for the rarity and collectability of the console, but its improved picture quality over other Famicom systems of the time. Sales figures for the Famicom Editor are unknown. Now let's leave the 1980s and the 8-bit era and jump into the 1990s and the next area of video gaming, starting with the first 16-bit console, the TurboGrafx-16. The TurboGrafx-16, known as the PC Engine outside of North America, is a video game console sold by NEC Home Electronics. It was the first console marketed in the fourth generation, which is more commonly known as the 16-bit era. It was released in Japan in 1987 and in North America in 1989. At just 5.5 by 5.5 inches, or 14 centimeters squared for you foreigners, the TurboGrafx-16 was the smallest major video game console ever made. The TurboGrafx-16 was marketed as a 16-bit system, although technically the console has an 8-bit CPU with a 16-bit graphics processor. The name was considered deceptive by most, and in Europe, the number 16 was even removed from the name and it was simply known as the TurboGrafx. In Japan, the PC Engine was very successful. It gained strong support and actually outsold the Famicom when it was released in 1987, eventually becoming the Super Famicom's main rival. However, the TurboGrafx-16 failed to break into the North American market and was considered a commercial failure. Games were released on HuCard cartridges and later the CD-ROM optical format with the TurboGrafx CD add-on. At least 17 models of the console were made, including portable versions and those that had the CD-ROM add-on built into the system. An enhanced model of the TurboGrafx-16, the PC Engine Super Graphics, which we already talked about on Tier 3, was rushed to market in 1989 but was also considered a failure. The final model was discontinued in 1994, having sold about 7.5 million units worldwide, including all variations. Keeping it in the early 1990s, let's move on to a new company's entry on the complete video game Iceberg, the Neo Geo. The Neo Geo AES, or Neo Geo for short, is a 4th generation game console first released in 1990. It was marketed as the first ever 24-bit console, however its CPU is only 16 bits and its GPU is 24 bits. See a trend here? Neo Geo was originally released as the MVS, or Multi-Video System, which was a stand-up video arcade cabinet that had the ability to change game cartridges like a home console. That was pretty unique, especially for the time. The home console version is called the AES, or Advanced Entertainment System. It was originally launched as a rental console for video game stores in Japan and called the Neo Geo Rental System, with its high price causing it not to be released for home use. This was later reversed due to high demand, and it came to the market as a luxury video game console. It was the most expensive home video game console ever released, costing $650 at the time, which is equivalent to about $1,500 today adjusted for inflation. The Neo Geo was a very powerful system when it was released, more powerful than any video game console at the time, and many arcade systems didn't catch up to its powerful specs until years later. Several successful video game series were released for the platform, such as Fatal Fury, Art of Fighting, Samurai Showdown, The King of Fighters, and Metal Slug. In 1994, a CD version of the console was produced called the Neo Geo CD. The console's hardware was essentially identical to the original Neo Geo, but it used a new CD-ROM format for its games instead of cartridges. The Neo Geo CD came in a few different versions during production, including a front-loading design which was only released in Japan. The Neo Geo did fairly well in Japan, but sales were low in the US due to its incredibly high costs. Production of the console lasted 7 years until 1997 when it was finally discontinued. Just under 1 million Neo Geo and Neo Geo CD consoles were sold worldwide. Keeping with the early to mid-1990s theme, let's jump back to Commodore and talk about their 32-bit gaming system, the Amiga CD32. The Amiga CD32 is a 32-bit video game console developed by Commodore and released only in Europe, Australia, Canada, and Brazil in 1993. The CD32 is part of a family of Amiga computers, and it uses CD-ROM as its media format. It was based on Commodore's Advanced Graphics Architecture chipset and has similar specifications to the Amiga 1200 personal computer. In fact, using third-party devices, it's possible to upgrade the CD32 with a keyboard, floppy drive, hard drive, RAM, and a mouse, turning it into the equivalent of an Amiga 1200 computer. The Amiga CD32 features a 14 MHz Motorola CPU, 2 MB of RAM, 1 MB of ROM, and up to a 1280 by 512 screen resolution and stereo sound. It sold for $399, which is equivalent to about $800 today, accounting for inflation. A total of 147 games were released for the Amiga CD32. Some of the more popular titles include Flink, Banshee, Guardian, Alien Breed Tower Assault, and Zool. The CD32 was initially successful in the UK and accounted for 32% of all CD-ROM based video game sales in 1993. It was planned to be released in the US, but the Commodore company went bankrupt the following year and the console was discontinued. During its short 2-year lifespan, the Amiga CD32 only sold about 100,000 units. And that's the brief history of the Amiga CD32. And rounding out the last console in Tier 4 is another rare Japanese exclusive, the FM Towns Marty. The FM Towns Marty is a 5th generation video game console released in 1993 by the Fujitsu Company exclusively in Japan. It was the very first 32-bit CD-based console sporting a 16 MHz AMD 386SX CPU, 2 MB of usable RAM, 640 KB of video RAM, and could display resolutions up to 720 by 480 with 256 colors on screen. The Marty had only composite and S-video output, and no other video connections are possible. The original cost when it was released was 98,000 yen, which is equivalent to about $1,500 today adjusted for inflation. The console came with a built-in CD-ROM and a 3.5-inch floppy disk drive. It was based on the FM Towns computer that Fujitsu released in 1989. The Marty was basically a gaming console designed to play PC games that ran on its own custom version of Windows 95. The controller has a 4-way D-pad, A and B buttons, a start and select, and one bumper button on the top. A 6-button controller was sold separately to play Street Fighter II, and an adapter was available to use the CPS flight stick. While there were over 600 games made for the Towns computer, many of which could be played on the Marty console, there were very few Marty original games made. In fact, after hours and hours of research, I couldn't get an exact number, but it seems to be less than 10 games were made for the console. In 1994, a new version of the console called the FM Towns Marty 2 was released. It featured a darker gray shell and a new lower price of 66,000 yen, which is about $950 today. But other than the color, it was basically identical to the first Marty. It was thought that the FM Towns Marty 2 would feature improvements to the original, such as a faster processor, but this was not the case. When it was released, it was speculated that the Marty 2 featured an Intel 486 CPU, but this was later discovered to be false. And there's also the FM Towns Car Marty for installation in automobiles. It included a built-in navigation system with audio and video guidance. It could also be detached from the vehicle and played at home. Despite having excellent hardware from a gameplay perspective, the FM Towns Marty had very poor sales in Japan. It was very expensive, and the custom hardware meant expandability was not easy. Software today is very rare and expensive due to the low production runs. Only 45,000 FM Marty consoles were produced before being discontinued in 1995. And that wraps up Tier 4 of the complete video game console Iceberg. It's time to drop down to Tier 5, starting with the oldest model on the list and what is considered to be the first true home video game console ever made, the Fairchild Channel F. The Fairchild Channel F, which stands for Channel Fun, is the first video game console to be based on a microprocessor and to use ROM cartridges instead of having games built into the system. While there were a few other home video game machines at the time like Pong, the Channel F is considered to be the first ever true home video game console. It was released in November of 1976 at a retail price of $170, which is equivalent to about $900 today accounting for inflation. It was originally launched as the Video Entertainment System, but when Atari released its video computer system the next year, Fairchild rebranded their machine as the Channel F. It had a proprietary Fairchild F8 CPU, 64 bytes of RAM, 2 kilobytes of video RAM, and a 128 by 64 screen resolution. It also had a small built-in speaker for sound. The controller was a joystick-style controller that was hardwired into the system. 27 games, called video carts, were produced for the Channel F and typically cost around $20 each, or about $100 today. Games consisted of mostly sports titles and puzzle games. In 1979, a newer remodel called the Fairchild Channel F2 was released, which featured detachable controllers, and the sound was routed through the FM modulator so it could be broadcast through the television speakers instead of the console itself. The internal components were simplified, and the outer case was updated slightly. Only 6 games were produced for the Channel F, and it struggled to compete with the Atari 2600. A number of licensed versions of the Channel F were released in Europe, including the Luxor Video Entertainment System in Sweden, Admin Grandstand Video Entertainment Computer in the UK, the Saba Video Play and Normandy Color Teleplay Micro P from Germany, and the Dumont Video Play and Barco Challenger that were released in Italy and Belgium. In total, the Fairchild Channel F sold only about 350,000 consoles before Fairchild sold the technology to Zircon International in 1979 and the system was discontinued in 1983. Moving on from the Channel F to one of its biggest competitors in the video game market, Atari and their 1987 console, the ZEGS. The Atari XE video game system, or Atari ZEGS for short, is a redesign of the Atari 65XE home computer and the final model in the Atari 8-bit family. It was released by the Atari Corporation in 1987 and marketed as a home video game console to compete with the Nintendo Entertainment System, Sega's Master System, and Atari's own 7800. It retailed for $159, which is equivalent to about $420 today adjusted for inflation. The ZEGS is compatible with all Atari 8-bit family hardware and software. Without a keyboard, the system operates as a standalone game console, but with a keyboard, it boots identically to the Atari XE computers. In fact, the system can use Atari 8-bit computer peripherals such as disk drives, modems, and printers. Atari packaged the ZEGS as a basic gaming setup consisting of only the console and joystick, and that version came with the game Missile Command. Also available was a deluxe computing set consisting of the console, keyboard, CX40 joysticks, the XG1 light gun, along with the games Flight Simulator 2 and Big Hunt. The Zeg's release was backed by new games, including Barnyard Blaster, plus cartridge ports of older games such as Fight Night, Load Runner, Necromancer, and Ball Blazer. In total, 32 games were produced for the Atari Zegs during its 5-year lifetime. Atari sold about 100,000 XE game systems during the Christmas season in 1987, which was every single console they could produce that year, but the hype soon died down due to the success of its competitors, the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Sega Master System, and by the early 1990s, sales were dwindling. Support for the system was dropped in 1992, along with the rest of Atari's 8-bit computers, the Atari 2600 and the 7800. Approximately 250,000 consoles were sold during its 5-year lifespan. The 1990s brought on a new type of video game console known as multimedia players. They not only played video games, but played other media as well. The first one on our list comes from Philips and is known as the CDI. The Compact Disc Interactive, more commonly referred to as the CDI, is a video game console developed by the Philips Corporation and released in 1990. The console was initially expected to appeal primarily to the education, point-of-sale, and home entertainment industries, but the CDI eventually became best known for its video games. It was released in 1990 at a cost of $1,000, which is well over $2,200 today adjusted for inflation. The CDI media is the same size as a CD, but has slightly more data storage and supports full motion video. Unlike CD-ROM drives, CDI players are complete computer systems centered around dedicated Motorola 68000 base microprocessors. It has a 32-bit, 15 MHz processor, 1 MB of RAM, and up to a 768 by 560 24-bit screen resolution. There are a wide variety of accessories for the CDI, not just limited to controllers. Some of these include multimedia remotes, mice, keyboards, rollerballs, touchpads, and many others. Media released on the CDI format includes video game and multimedia reference titles, such as interactive encyclopedias and museum tours, which were popular before internet access was widespread as it is today. The Philips CDI system also implemented internet features such as subscriptions, web browsing, downloading, email, and online play. Philips' aim with its players was to combine features of a PC, CD player, and game console, but at a lower price than a personal computer with a CD-ROM drive. While Philips itself made 20 different versions of the CDI, which were named as the 100 series through the 900 series, with many submodels in each series, the CDI console was also manufactured by more than 10 different companies other than Philips. Some of these models include the Magnavox CDI, the LG CGI 700, Sony CDI Discman, Kyocera Portable Pro 100S model, and many others. Mostly due to its incredibly high cost and the introduction of low-cost home computers like Dell and Gateway, the Philips CDI struggled to maintain sales through the mid-90s, and it was all but abandoned by Philips in 1996. In 1998, the CDI was discontinued completely, and in total, right around 1 million consoles were sold worldwide during its 6 years of production. Keeping with the theme of multimedia video game consoles, let's move on to Commodore's version, the CD-TV. The Commodore CD-TV, which stands for Commodore Dynamic Total Vision, is a home video game and multimedia console. It was first advertised at $499 in 1990, but was eventually released at a price of $1,000 in 1991, which is equivalent to about $2,200 a day accounting for inflation. The CD-TV is essentially a Commodore Amiga 500 home computer with a CD-ROM drive and remote control. With the optional keyboard, mouse, and floppy disk drive, it had the functionality of a regular Amiga computer. Commodore marketed the machine as an all-in-one multimedia device, which competed with and had similar features as the Philips CDI we just talked about. The CD-TV had a Motorola 7 MHz 68000 CPU, 1 MB of RAM, 265 KB of ROM, and up to 640 by 256 16-bit resolution. It used CD-ROM for its media and had a variety of accessories and peripherals such as mice, keyboards, remote controllers, floppy drives, and printers. The CD-TV was designed to look more like a VCR or home stereo of the time rather than a video game console, and there was only 22 games made for it, the most popular being SimCity, Lemmings, and Indiana Jones. Due to its high cost and lower performance compared to similar platforms, the CD-TV was a failure for Commodore. In 1994, it was discontinued to be replaced by the Amiga CD32, which we talked about on Tier 4. Less than 100,000 consoles were sold worldwide during its 3-year production. Okay, we have one more multimedia game console on this tier to talk about, and this one comes from Pioneer. It's known as the Laser Active. The Laser Active is a 4th generation video game console capable of playing laser discs, compact discs, console games, and karaoke discs. It was released by the Pioneer Corporation in 1993 at a cost of $970 or about $2,000 today, accounting for inflation. In addition to Laser Active games, separately sold add-on modules called packs accepted Sega Mega Drive and Genesis game cartridges, as well as PC Engine and TurboGrafx-16 ROM cartridges and CD-ROM games. Some of the packs available for the Laser Active included the Mega LD S1 pack that allowed the system to play both Sega Mega Drive discs and Genesis game cartridges. It came with a Laser Active branded version of Sega's 6-button controller. This pack module cost $600 or about $1,000 today, which is more than both Sega consoles would have cost, but hey, at least it played Laserdiscs too, right? Another pack was the LD ROM 2 N1 pack that allowed the system to play TurboGrafx-16 HuCard games as well as SuperGrafx CD-ROM games. It also played Laserdiscs and came with a Laser Active branded version of NEC's TurboPad controller. It also retailed for $600, but very few of these were sold and are very rare today. A third pack available was the Karaoke K10 pack that allowed the system to play karaoke discs. It had 2 microphone inputs on the front, along with separate volume and tone control knobs. It retailed for $300 at the time, or about $500 today. And last but not least, the Computer Interface PC1 pack that had an RS-232 port enabling the system to be controlled by a home computer with custom software. It also came with a 33-button remote instead of the standard 24-button remote, as well as a floppy disk drive. In total, there were 33 games produced for the Laser Active, most of which were Japanese exclusives, as only 18 of them were available in the United States. Due to the insane cost of the system and its pack add-ons, which were many times more expensive than the consoles they were designed to replace, the Laser Active systems only sold about 10,000 units worldwide in the entire 3 years it was produced. Due to the incredible rarity of the system, and especially the pack add-ons, they are all sought by collectors to this day. Okay, that's enough with multimedia gaming systems for now, so let's get back to dedicated video game consoles and head back to Japan and talk about the NEC Turbo Duo. The Turbo Duo is a 4th generation video game console developed by NEC Home Electronics for the North American market. It was released in 1993 at a price of $300, which is about $600 today adjusted for inflation. It is the US version of the Japanese PC Engine Duo game console that was released 2 years earlier in 1991. The Turbo Duo integrates the capabilities of the TurboGrafx-16 and its CD-ROM drive add-on, the TurboGrafx CD, into a single redesigned unit with an updated BIOS and more memory. It has a 7 MHz CPU, 192 KB of working RAM, 64 KB of video RAM, and a 512 by 240 resolution with 841 colors. The RAM increase and BIOS update gave the American Turbo Duo and the Japanese PC Engine Duo compatibility with all CD-ROM and Super CD-ROM games. Like the TurboGrafx CD, the Turbo Duo can read compact discs, digital audio, and CD-G discs. The Turbo Duo, however, cannot read PC Engine HuCards without a modification or an adapter. 3 versions were released in Japan: the original PC Engine Duo in 1991 that sold for 68,000 yen, or about $1,000 today, the PC Engine Duo R with a retail price of 40,000 yen, or about $800 today, which removed the 3.5mm headphone jack and the locking switch for the lid of the CD-ROM drive, and finally the PC Engine Duo RX in 1994, which has a bluer case and was bundled with the Arcade Pad 6, a 6-button controller instead of the standard Turbo Pad controller. The console was primarily designed to play TurboGrafx-16 and TurboGrafx CD games, and only 6 new games were made for the Turbo Duo console, including Sim Earth, Super Air Zonk, and Godzilla. I couldn't find an exact number, but sales for the Turbo Duo were very low, and the console was discontinued in 1995 with the development of the PCFX, which we'll talk about in the next tier. Alright, now we're going to get into a couple of consoles marketed for a different audience, starting with one made by Sega, the Pico. The Sega Pico, also known as Kids Computer Pico, is an educational video game console made by Sega Toys. Marketed as edutainment, the main focus of the Pico was educational video games for children between the ages of 3 and 7 years old. The Pico was released in 1993 in Japan and 1994 in North America at a cost of $139 or about $275 today accounting for inflation. It had a 7.6 MHz processor, 64 kilobytes of RAM, and a 420 by 320 resolution. The Pico uses the same hardware as a Sega Genesis console, but it was designed to look more like a laptop computer than a traditional game console. The Pico included a stylus called the Magic Pen to draw on the touchpad, and games were played using the pen like a mouse or by using the directional buttons on the game console itself. Unlike a laptop, the Pico does not have a traditional screen and must be connected to an external monitor or TV. Game cartridges for the system were called storyware and took the form of picture books with the cartridge on the bottom and were plugged into the Pico. When the pages are turned on the storyware books, the television screen would change along with it. Games for the Pico focused on education, including music, counting, spelling, reading, matching, and coloring. Game titles included licensed franchises such as The Lion King, Winnie the Pooh, and Sonic the Hedgehog. In 2005, a newer model was introduced exclusively in Japan called the Advanced Pico Bina. Improvements included the ability to play games without an external television, as well as multiplayer capabilities and adaptive difficulty. In 2008, the Pico Bina Lite was introduced, also exclusively in Japan, with reduced features and a lower price point. The original Pico was sold until 1998, and the Japanese exclusive Pico Bina until 2011. In total, more than 3.5 million Pico consoles and 11 million game cartridges were sold worldwide. Let's move on from the Sega Pico to a similar console that was produced around the same time, made by Japanese game manufacturer Bandai. It's the Playdia. The Bandai Playdia is a 5th generation video game console released exclusively in Japan in 1994 at the initial price of 24,000 yen, which is about $180 today, adjusted for inflation. It was designed and marketed for a young audience, the main target group being elementary school children. Like many consoles of the era, such as the Laseractive and the 3DO Interactive Multiplayer, the Playdia was marketed more as a multimedia home entertainment system than just a dedicated gaming console. The Playdia was an 8-bit console and featured a 12 MHz Toshiba CPU, 256 kilobytes of RAM, and 16 kilobytes of ROM. It uses a single wireless joypad with simple controls, and CD-ROM as its media. The Playdia could create anime-style full-motion video with its CD-ROM-based games. The majority of the games were interactive learning experiences, however Bandai did create a few games based on their franchise series, including Gundam, Sailor Moon, Ultraman, and Dragon Ball Z. In total, 33 games were made for the Playdia, but it struggled due to the fact that it was an 8-bit console competing with 16 and 32-bit consoles at the time. This being the major cause of the Playdia having very poor sales, Bandai declared the console a failure and it was discontinued in 1996. Moving away from the children-targeted consoles, we now get into the very first and only video game console directly marketed to girls, the Casio Loopy. The Casio Loopy is a 32-bit video game console released exclusively in Japan in 1995. It was unique in that the marketing for it was completely targeted to female gamers. It originally sold for 25,000 yen or about $350 today adjusted for inflation. The Loopy includes a built-in thermal color printer that can be used to create stickers from game screenshots. An optional accessories, called the Magical Shop, is a video capture device to obtain images from VCRs and DVD players. Users can import these images into the Loopy and add text to make stickers. The Loopy features one controller port for use with a standard game controller or with a mouse, which was sold separately. 10 games were made for the Loopy and include titles like Anime Land, Bow Wow Puppy Love Story, and Caricature Artist. The Loopy is very rare, and information and even pictures are very hard to find. It was produced for 3 years until it was discontinued in 1998, and total sales numbers are unknown. And that's it for Tier 5 of the complete video game console Iceberg. So let's get right into it, take a deep dive into Tier 6, starting with a little known video game console made by one of the largest computer and electronic manufacturers in the world, Apple. The Apple Pippin was designed by Apple Computers in 1996, not only as a video game console, but a multimedia device. Apple licensed the console to the Bandai Corporation for release in Japan. It sold for $599, which is equivalent to around $1,200 today, accounting for inflation. The Pippin is a 5th generation game console based on the Apple Macintosh computer platform and runs the classic Mac OS operating system. It has a 66 MHz PowerPC processor and 8 MB of RAM, with upgradable RAM modules available. A PCI expansion slot was also built into the system, and Apple encouraged third-party companies to develop peripherals to use this PCI expansion port. The Pippin came with one gamepad controller and also had a built-in dial-up modem for internet access. Some accessories made for the system included a docking station with a 3.5-inch floppy drive, a 320 MB external disk drive, a wireless gamepad controller called the Apple Jack, and a keyboard/drawing pad with a stylus that resembles a tablet. Games were manufactured on CD-ROM format, and in total there were well over 100 games developed for the Pippin, although most of them were only available in Japan. There were about 15 games released to the US market, but the consoles and games are not region locked, so you can play any of the games on any variation of the console if you can get your hands on them. 3 main variations of the Pippin were produced: the original Bandai Pippin Atmark, which was released in the US and Japan in 1996 and was available in black or white. The Bandai Pippin World, which was released the same year, was only available in black and was basically just a standard Pippin, but it came with a free 6-month internet account bundled with the console. And the Cat's Media Pippin KMP 2000 that released in 1997 in Canada and Europe and was only available in gray. This is the rarest of the 3 versions of the console. All 3 systems were essentially the same, but for the Cat's version having an SCSI interface port available on the back of the console. By the time the Pippin was released, the home video game market was already dominated by the Sega Saturn, Sony PlayStation, and Super Nintendo, and with such a small and lackluster game library, along with the $599 price tag, the Pippin was far too expensive to compete. When Steve Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, he stopped development of the Pippin and forced Bandai and Cat's Media to stop production of their versions of the console as well. So during its very short 2-year lifespan, it is estimated that only about 42,000 consoles were sold worldwide, making the Pippin very hard to come by for collectors even today. And that's the brief history of Apple's very short-lived home video game console that you may have not known about. Now from here, we're going back a few years to 1980 to the Commodore Corporation and their 8-bit video game system, the Commodore 64 GS. The Commodore 64 game system, more commonly referred to as the Commodore 64 GS, is a cartridge-based game console based on their popular Commodore 64 home computer of the time. It was released exclusively in Europe in 1990 at a price of £99, which is about $250 today, converted and adjusted for inflation. The C64 GS was not Commodore's first gaming system based on the C64 hardware. However, unlike the 1982 Max machine, a game-oriented computer based on a very cut-down version of the same hardware family, the C64 gaming system is internally very similar to the Commodore 64 computer and is technically compatible with most of its software. The 64 GS came bundled with a cartridge that had 4 games on it. These included Fiendish Freddy's Big Top of Fun, International Soccer, Limbo's Quest, and Clax. Commodore promised a game library of over 100 games, but in the end only 28 were made, and only 9 of them were new games made for the console. Most of them were just ports of much older games from the 1980s. But the problems with the 64 GS don't stop there. Despite having lots of games and software already available on cartridges from the Commodore 64 computer, the lack of a keyboard for the 64 GS meant that most of them couldn't be used with the console. This meant that most of the Commodore 64 games and software, while technically compatible with the 64 GS, were completely unplayable on the console. One example is the standard Commodore 64 version of Terminator 2 Judgment Day that was actually designed for the console. The game required the user to press a key on a keyboard at the start menu to access the game, but since the 64 GS didn't have a keyboard or a port to even plug one in, the game was literally unplayable. You could, however, play the game on a standard Commodore 64 computer using a joystick like the one the 64 GS had. So overall, the 64 GS was a complete failure. It was poorly designed, had old, dated games, and had no accessories. All of that and the fact that it was trying to compete with Nintendo, Sega, and PlayStation meant the end for the 64 GS. In total, there were 80,000 consoles produced, but Commodore could only sell 20,000 of them. The 64 GS was a big L for Commodore. Moving on from one failed console to another, we head back to Japan to the NEC Corporation and their last video game console they ever produced, the PC-FX. The PC-FX is a 32-bit game console developed by NEC and released in 1994. It was the successor to the TurboGrafx 16 and Turbo Duo, and was only released in Japan at a price of 50,000 yen, which is just over $1,000 today, converted and adjusted for inflation. Its form factor is designed to be more like a tower PC than a game console, so it could be easily upgraded with more memory and peripherals. However, due to the fact that the PCFX did not have a 3D polygon-based graphics chip, it was inferior to the other 5th generation consoles of the time. The PCFX used CD-ROM for its games, doing away with the HuCard games from the TurboGrafx. The controller is almost identical to the 6-button controller from the Turbo Duo, except the turbo buttons were replaced with standard A and B buttons. The game library consisted of 62 games, most of which were based on popular Japanese anime franchises. Launch games included titles like Graduation 2 Neo Generation FX, Battle Heat, and Team Innocent. A large portion of the PCFX games were essentially just anime videos with cutscenes allowing the user to play games for a bit in between the videos. The reason for this was that while the PCFX lacked 3D graphics, it could process 30 pictures per second, allowing it to play full motion video faster and with better quality than any other console at the time. So NEC took advantage of this and made most of its games primarily just videos. However, the fact that games weren't very immersive, the console lacked 3D graphics, and it was incredibly expensive, the PCFX was a commercial failure. It was discontinued in 1998 after less than 4 years of production and would be the last video game console NEC would ever produce. In total, only about 400,000 consoles were sold. Moving on from NEC to one of the more weird-looking consoles on the Iceberg, we head back to the US for the ViewMaster Interactive Vision. The ViewMaster Interactive Vision was released in 1989 only in the US at a price of $120, which is equivalent to about $280 today, adjusted for inflation. The console was marketed to younger kids, and most of the games were based on Disney or Sesame Street franchises. The Interactive Vision is different than most other video game consoles, and that games were stored on VHS tapes rather than cartridges, discs, or cassettes. The system came with a simple controller that included a joystick and 5 buttons, and a VCR was required to play the games on a television. The console would then add graphics on screen over the video. As the video played, characters on screen would talk to the player and ask them questions or tell them to make choices determining the gameplay outcome. For example, at the end of the game Muppet Madness, Kermit the Frog and Gonzo ask you to choose which character you want to sing the closing song. In Kermit's version, he sings a song called Everything Was Wonderful, and in Gonzo's version, he sings a different song called Everything Was Terrible. Due to the fact that games were on a VHS tape, there is only one video track. The console digitally generates graphics to overlay on top of the video, such as the movement of characters' mouths. This allowed it to appear that the characters are talking directly to the player with custom animations. In the game Muppet Studio Presents, you're the director. Kermit asks you to create a Muppet movie in the game and allows the player to choose to be a good director or a bad director. During the game, you have to collect money bags that are displayed on the screen, and if you don't collect enough of them, the game ends. In total, there were only 7 games produced for the Interactive Vision, and they were all pretty basic 8-bit graphics similar to the ColecoVision. As you can probably guess, the console didn't do very well, and was soon discontinued the next year. I couldn't find the exact number of consoles sold, but it's estimated to be less than 50,000, and while they are pretty rare, they aren't really sought out by collectors today. Moving on from the Interactive Vision to a more traditional game console that is actually very rare today, the Funtech Super A-Can. The Super A-Can is a 16-bit video game console released exclusively in Taiwan in 1995 at a cost of 2,900 new Taiwan dollars, which is equivalent to about 185 US dollars today, converted and adjusted for inflation. It's based around the Motorola 68000 microchip, which is also used in the Sega Genesis and the Neo Geo. The controller was similar in appearance to the Super Nintendo controller, with a directional pad, start, select, and 4 face buttons. It used the same controller connector port as the Sega Genesis, but it wasn't compatible with Genesis controllers due to the internal wiring. Only 12 games were made for the system, mostly fighting and platform games such as Sango Fighters and Super Dragon Force. There were 11 other games planned to be released, but the console was discontinued before they could be completed. A CD-ROM attachment, similar to Sega's Mega CD add-on, was also planned but was never released. The Super A-Can failed because it was too expensive, and due to the fact that it was a 16-bit console released in the 32-bit era. It had no chance of competing with the PlayStation, N64, and Sega Saturn that had 3D graphics, while the ACAN still had Sega Genesis hardware. The console sold so poorly that Funtech actually lost $6 million producing it. Just 1 year after being released, the console was discontinued in 1996, and Funtech destroyed all of the equipment used to make the consoles and sold the leftover systems as scrap parts. Because of this, the console is incredibly rare and hard to find today. And that's the brief history of the Super ACAN. Now let's talk about another multimedia gaming device, the Tandy Viz. The Tandy Video Information System, or Viz for short, is an interactive multimedia player similar to the 3DO, CDI, and CD-TV we've already talked about. It was released in 1992 at a price of $699, which is about $1,500 today adjusted for inflation. The Tandy Viz was sold exclusively at Radio Shack stores using the Memorex brand, both of which Tandy owned at the time. The Viz had an Intel 286 CPU, 1 MB of ROM, 1 MB of RAM, and a built-in modem for internet access. It ran on a modular version of the Windows 3.1 operating system and used CD-ROM as its media format. It was capable of connecting up to 2 wireless controllers simultaneously. About 65 games and media were made for the Viz, most of which were learning software like encyclopedias, ebooks, and translators. Only 10 true games were produced for the Viz, and the games were far from exciting. The more popular game titles were Lynx, The Challenge of Golf, Sherlock Holmes, Consulting Detective, and The Adventures of Victor Vector and Yondo, The Vampire's Coffin. The Viz was not a successful console at all, partly due to the fact that it was a Radio Shack exclusive, and partly due to the large amount of competition from other multimedia consoles of the time. Radio Shack employees jokingly referred to the Viz acronym meaning virtually impossible to sell. After only 2 years of production, the system was discontinued early in 1994, having only sold 11,000 units, making it a very rare system today. Alright, let's jump back to the early 1980s to the very beginning of the home video game console era and take a look at the Epoch CassetteVision. The CassetteVision is a home video game console made by Epoch and released exclusively in Japan in 1981. It sold for 13,500 yen, which is equivalent to about $325 US today, converted and adjusted for inflation. The CassetteVision is a second-generation console and has similar hardware to the Atari 2600. It's the successor to the TV Vader console that was made the year before in 1980. The TV Vader was only available with one game, Space Invaders, and it was built into the game system. So although technically it is a video game console, I've decided that I won't be including it on a tier of its own. Now back to the CassetteVision. In the US, we think of cassettes as a magnetic audio tape from the 80s, but in Japan, the cassette is a name given to a standard ROM cartridge used to store video games. The controls for the CassetteVision are very strange. They consist of 4 knobs built into the console itself, and they aren't unremovable controllers, so the players have to sit at the console to play games. A light gun was available to use with 4 of its shooting games, which connected to the console using an aux connector. This was the only accessory ever made for the console. There were only 12 games produced, and they were priced at 4,000 yen, which is about $100 today. Game titles included Baseball, Astro Command, Pac Monster, and Battle Vader. The reason for the high cost of the games is the fact that the ROM, RAM, and the CPU are all in one chip stored in the game cartridge itself. The console itself would only contain the power supply, the controls, and the video and sound output. 2 years later, in 1983, Epoch released the CassetteVision Junior that was a minimal version of the standard CassetteVision. It removed the knobs on the console and replaced them with more traditional switches and buttons. However, it also removed the aux connector, so the light gun can't be used with this system. With Nintendo releasing the Famicom system in Japan in 1983, which was a much more powerful and superior system, Epoch decided to discontinue the CassetteVision in 1984 after 4 years of production, having sold about 400,000 units. Now let's move on to another console from the early 1980s, and one that is very similar to the CassetteVision Junior, the Arcadia 2001. The Arcadia 2001 is a second-generation video game console released by the Emerson Radio Company in 1982 at a price of $99 or about $300 today adjusted for inflation. The console had a controller very similar to the Intellivision, with a 12-button keypad, fire buttons on the side, and a directional pad that a joystick could be attached to. The console itself had 5 buttons including power, reset, start, select, and option. The system had a 3.5 MHz Signetic 2650 CPU, 1 KB of RAM, 208 by 128 screen resolution, and a built-in speaker to produce beeps for audio. The power supply for the Arcadia ran at 12 volts, so it could technically be used in a car or a boat. 35 games were produced for the console in cartridge format, and another 12 games were made for the clone consoles. More popular game titles included Astro Invader, Crazy Climber, and Route 16. Emerson actually created more popular games like Pac-Man, Galaxian, and Defender for the Arcadia console, but was never able to release them because Atari started to sue. Some of these games, such as Breakaway and Space Raiders, were later released as clone games. Emerson licensed rights to the console to Bandai in Japan, and over 30 clones were made to sell worldwide. Some of these include the Hanimex HMG 2650 that was released in Germany, Canada, and Australia, the Intervision 2001 released in Switzerland and Finland, the Ormatu 2001 that was sold only in the Netherlands, the Soundic MPT-03 released in Singapore and Finland, and the Chico Telefever released only in Germany. Even though the console was produced for a variety of countries around the world, it failed to compete with the Atari 2600 and other consoles of the era, and after only a year and a half of production, the Arcadia 2001 was discontinued in 1984. And that's it for Tier 6 of the complete video game console Iceberg. So let's drop down to Tier 7, starting with one of the very first home video game consoles ever made, the Coleco Telstar. The Telstar is a series of first-generation home video game consoles made by Coleco from 1976 to 1978. It is the predecessor to the popular ColecoVision game console, and the unit was based around the AY3-8500 chip, which was a Pong chip developed by General Instruments and later licensed for manufacturing by Magnavox, who at that time all console makers had to pay royalties to as the inventor of the home video game system. There were 14 different versions of the console released in the Telstar series. Each version came pre-packaged with an assortment of various games on it and had different controller styles depending on the games it had. So let's give some of these various consoles a brief rundown. The first version released in 1976 was simply called the Telstar. It had simple controls on the console consisting of 2 knobs that the user turned. It came with 3 games, which were hockey, handball, and tennis. A version called the Telstar Classic was released the same year and was internally the same but had a fancier wooden case instead of the original plastic model. A deluxe model was also released in Canada, again with the same internals but slightly different case and the option for French language. In 1977, the Telstar Ranger was released, which added 3 new games to the system on top of the original 3. These new games included High-Lie, Target, and Skeet. This version of the console also came with a light gun. That same year, the Telstar Alpha was released, which again had the same 3 original games but added Squash to the lineup. This model looked very similar to the Ranger, released the same year. Also released in 1977 was the Telstar Colormatic, which was the first version of the system to introduce color graphics. Although very basic, each game's graphics were a different color. This version of the console was also the first to introduce handheld controllers. The system came with 4 games installed that included hockey, handball, tennis, and High-Lie. At the end of 1977, Coleco released the most unique version of the Telstar, known as the Telstar Arcade. This version had the standard controls found in previous consoles, but also added a built-in racing wheel with a throttle, and a built-in light gun. This version of the system was also cartridge-based, and came with the games Tennis, Road Racing, and Quick Draw. The following year, in 1978, Coleco released another unique version of the Telstar called the Combat. This model was different in that it had 4 joysticks, 2 for each player. These joysticks were designed to work with the new games included in the system that included Combat, Night Battle, Robot Battle, and Camouflage Combat. Many other versions of the Telstar were released, but they were very similar to the ones we just talked about, so we won't go through all 14 of them. Over 1 million of just the first version of the Coleco Telstar consoles were sold worldwide. It was so successful with all of its variations that it's estimated that more than 1.5 million systems were sold in total during its short 2-year production. Moving on from the Telstar to another first-generation console released the same year, let's talk about the RCA Studio 2. The RCA Studio 2 was released in January of 1977, a full 10 months before the Telstar. The graphics of Studio 2 games were black and white and resembled those of earlier Pong consoles and their clones. The Studio 2 also did not have joysticks or handheld game controllers, but instead used 2 10-button keypads that were built into the console itself. The system was capable of making simple beep sounds with slight variations in tone and length for game audio. The Studio 2 included 5 built-in games that included Bowling, Doodle, Addition, Freeway, and Patterns. The Studio 2 was not a successful console at all. The Fairchild Channel F that was released a year before made it obsolete before it was even launched, and the Atari 2600, which was superior to both of them, was released just 10 months later. After poor sales in 1977, RCA discontinued the Studio 2 the next year. After the disaster of the Studio 2, RCA started to work on an updated version of the console called the RCA Studio 3, but with the release of the Atari VCS, Bally Astrocade, and the upcoming Magnavox Odyssey 2, it was clear that RCA was about to release another inferior console than the competition. So RCA gave up on manufacturing the Studio 3 itself and licensed the technology to other companies for production. These variations of the Studio 3 include the Konica M1200, which was to be released in North America, the Mustang 9016 Telespiel computer released in Germany, the Trevi M1200 microcomputer released in Italy, the Academy Apollo 80 released in the United Kingdom, the Sheen M1200 microcomputer released in Australia, the Soundic Victory Home TV Programmer MPTO2 also in Australia, the Hanimex Zhu TV MPTO2 released in France, and the Toshiba Visicom C100 released in Japan. As expected, the Studio 3 did just as poorly as the Studio 2, mostly due to the fact that the new console was almost identical internally to the previous version, but for the fact that it could play games in color. The graphics and gameplay were no match to other consoles releasing at this time from Atari and Magnavox. In total, there were less than 100,000 consoles sold worldwide of all variations, and most were discontinued within just a year or two. And that's the brief history of RCA in the home video game market. Keeping with the era of the late 1970s, we now move on to the Advanced Programmable Video System. The 1292 Advanced Programmable Video System is the second-generation video game console released by the European company Audiosonic in 1978. It is part of a group of software-compatible consoles which included the Intercon VC4000 and the Voltmace database. The system had a 0.887 MHz Signetics processor, 43 bytes of RAM, and used ROM cartridges for its games. The console was produced by different companies and sold with different names, but not every console is compatible with others due to differences in the shapes and dimensions of the cartridge slots. Some of these variations include the original Audiosonic 1292 Advanced Programmable Video System released in most of Europe, the Hanimex HMG 1392 Advanced Programmable Video System released in Australia and New Zealand, the Acetronic MPU 1000 available in the United Kingdom, the Voltmace database also available in the United Kingdom, Society Occitane Electronic OC2000 released exclusively in France, the ITMC Video Ordinateur MPT-05 also released in France, and the Grundig Superplay computer available only in Germany. Not much more information is known about the APVS, and it was discontinued in 1983 due to competition from more advanced video game consoles of the time. Okay, that's enough of these old video game consoles from the 1970s for now. Let's jump forward to the year 2000 to VM Labs' multimedia console, the Nuon. The Nuon is a 6th-generation 32-bit multimedia gaming system developed by VM Labs. It was released in 2000 at a price of $299 or about $500 today adjusted for inflation. The Nuon is essentially a DVD player capable of playing 3D games. You could also play audio CDs and the system would generate visualizations in sync with the music. There were plans to provide internet access in the second generation of Nuon players, but they were never produced. The systems were made by 4 different companies. The 2 more common versions are the Samsung Nuon DVD player, released in America, Europe, and Korea, and the Toshiba Nuon DVD player, which was also released in North America and Asia. There was also a version made by RCA, as well as another made by Motorola, both of which are incredibly rare. All of them have generally the same internal specifications, including either a 54 MHz or 108 MHz Nuon processor, 32 MB of RAM, 24 KB of ROM, and a 64 MB internal drive with a 250 MB optional upgrade. Only 8 games were released for the Nuon, and some of the more popular titles were Tempest 3000, Space Invaders XL, Freefall 3050 AD, and Merlin Racing. The controller was a Logitech gamepad, and others were available such as the AirPlay wireless controller, a Pro Elite controller, and a few others. There were also 4 DVD releases utilizing Nuon technology, all of which were released by 20th Century Fox, and the new one offered the ability to fast forward, reverse, and zoom in and out more smoothly than a standard DVD player. The new one was very short-lived and was discontinued in 2004 with total sales numbers unknown. As the new one was leaving the market in 2004, a new type of video game console was arriving, a motion-based system known as the Zavexport. The Zavexport is a fitness-based home video game console developed by Japanese company SSD Limited and released in 2004 during the 6th generation of video game consoles. The Zavexport was originally sold at a cost of $79.99 in the US, which is about $125 today adjusted for inflation. It was also released in Europe under the name Damios Interactive System. The Zavexport was developed by 8 engineers who worked on the Nintendo Entertainment System. The processors were built into the games themselves, with the more basic games using the same 8-bit CPU that the NES had, and more advanced games were released using the 16-bit CPU that was in the Super Nintendo. The console uses cartridges and wireless controllers. The controllers are shaped like sports equipment, like baseball bats and tennis rackets, with the player's actions represented on the television screen through the use of sensors in the controllers, very similar to the yet-released Wii. Many of the games released for the system came with specific controllers needed for the game to work, while others were sold separately. Many of the controllers were compatible with several games, and there were 23 games made in total, 10 of which were sold in the US, and even fewer available in Europe. The Nintendo Wii released 2 years later in 2006 and completely took over the market with a better library of games and better technology. In 2008, SSD ended production of the Zavexport and sold the remaining stock for as low as $19.99. The Zavexport was still available as late as 2012, but they were just selling old stock from their warehouse, and in 2003, the company ceased operations completely. Now moving on to a very rare console from the 1990s, only available in Europe, it's the Amstrad GX4000. The GX4000 is a video game console that was manufactured by the British electronics company Amstrad. It was released in 1990, only in Europe, at a price of £99 or about $275 today, converted and adjusted for inflation. There were close to 30 games produced for the GX4000, and the system came bundled with the game Burnin' Rubber and 2 controllers. Some more notable games were RoboCop 2, Pang, Navy SEALs, and Switchblade. The controller was similar to 8-bit gaming systems of the era and resembled those of the SNES and TurboGrafx-16, but with only directional pad and 2 face buttons. Initial reviews for the console before it was launched were good, saying it was a neat little system with potential, especially for its low price. But with the company only having a budget of £20 million for the console and its marketing, there were very few systems available when it was released, almost no advertising, and consumer interest in the console was quickly lost. With competition and heavy marketing from Sega, Nintendo, and PlayStation, the GX4000 was quickly forgotten. Within a few weeks of the initial launch, the system could be bought at discounted prices, and in just a few months, some stores were selling it for as little as $29.99. Within 1 year of its release, Amstrad discontinued the GX4000 completely, having sold only 14,000 consoles, making it incredibly rare and hard to find today. Going back to the early 1980s, we move on to a console that actually started as a full-fledged home computer, the Tomy Tutor. The Tomy Tutor, originally sold in Japan as the Piuta and in the UK as the Grandstand Tutor, is a home video game computer produced by the Japanese toy maker Tomy. The system was first released in Japan in 1982 at a cost of 60,000 yen, which is well over $1,300 today, converted and adjusted for inflation. It was then released in the UK and in the United States the following year. It was internally very similar but not identical to the Texas Instruments TI-99 home computer, and used a similar Texas Instruments 16-bit CPU. It had 16 kilobytes of RAM, 20 kilobytes of ROM, and a 256 by 192 resolution with 16 colors on screen. There were 26 games made for the Tomy Tutor, featuring a number of well-known titles, more notably Frogger, Scramble, Tron, and Bomberman. The console had 2 controllers that each had 2 buttons and a round pad for directional movements, and a keyboard was built into the system itself. Also in 1983, Tomy released the Tutor Junior, which was a trimmed-down console version of the original system. It had the same controllers, but removed the keyboard and replaced it with more simple buttons to handle basic functions. The Tutor Junior was sold for half the cost of the original, priced at 30,000 yen. The following year, a new version called the Tutor Mark II was released, with essentially the same features as the original system, but with a mechanical keyboard to replace the chiclet-style keyboard. With the Mark II, the cost was reduced even further to just 20,000 yen. But even so, the Tutor failed to sell. One of the major reasons for the failure was not the system itself, but its marketing. The Tudor was marketed as a children's computer, stating that the machine would let an 8-year-old child use it without adult supervision, when in fact, it was practically a cheaper version of the TI-99 computer that any adult would have been happy to have. This, along with the release of the Nintendo Famicom and 6 other video game consoles within just a 2-month period in Japan, the whole line was discontinued in 1985 with about 140,000 units of both the computer and the console versions sold worldwide. Moving on from one computer/game console hybrid to another, it's the VTech CreatiVision. The CreatiVision is a hybrid computer and home video game console released by VTech in 1982 at a cost of $295, which is about $600 today adjusted for inflation. The CreatiVision had an 8-bit, 2 MHz CPU, 1 KB of RAM, and 16 KB of video RAM with a 256 by 192 screen resolution in 16 colors. The console had 2 controllers that each had a keypad and joystick very similar to the ColecoVision and Atari 5200. It also has an I/O port for connecting a cassette player, keyboard, floppy drive, printers, and other peripherals. There were 18 games produced for the CreatiVision. Some of these titles included Chopper Rescue, Deep Sea Adventure, Sonic Invader, and Tank Attack. There were many different versions of the console made by different manufacturers depending on the market. Some of these models include the Japanese CreatiVision sold by Cherryco, the Educat 2002 sold in most of Eastern Europe, Italy, and South Africa, the Dick Smith Wizard sold in Australia and New Zealand, the Funvision video game system also sold in Australia and New Zealand, along with the Henimex Ramses. There was a US release plan, but it was never realized. The system was not very successful due to strong competition and the fact that it wasn't a superior computer or a game system, and it was discontinued in 1985 after only 3 years of production. VTech gave up on the computer/game hybrid systems, but it did produce the Laser 2001 computer system in 1986 that was compatible with the CreatiVision games. And finishing up Tier 7, the last console on our list is the Epoch Super Cassette Vision. The Super Cassette Vision is a second-generation video game console made by Epoch and is the successor to the Cassette Vision, which we talked about on Tier 6. It was released in Japan in 1984 at a price of 15,000 yen, which is about $300 US today, converted and adjusted for inflation. It competed with Nintendo's Famicom system and the Sega SG-1000. The console is an 8-bit system with a 4 MHz CPU, 128 bytes of RAM, 4 KB of ROM, and a 309 by 246 screen resolution in 16 colors. It came with 2 controllers that were hardwired into the console, each having just 2 action buttons and a single joystick for movement. The controllers were stored under a lid on the front of the console. There were a total of 30 games produced for the system. Some of the more popular titles include Professional Wrestling, Pole Position 2, Boulder Dash, and Dragon Slayer. Later in 1984, the console was released in France under the name Yeno Super Cassette Vision. And in 1985, Epoch released an all-pink version of the console in Japan targeted at women called the Super Lady Cassette Vision that came in a fancy case and with a higher price of 20,000 yen. But by 1986, it was clear that Epoch just couldn't compete with Nintendo and Sega, and the company decided to cease production of the console. About 300,000 units were sold in total during its 4-year lifespan, and the Super Cassette Vision would be the last video game console Epoch would ever produce. And that's it for Tier 7 of the complete video game console Iceberg. So let's drop down to Tier 8, starting with one of the very first home video game consoles ever made, the Bally Astrocade. The Bally Astrocade, also known as the Bally Arcade, is a second-generation video game console and simple computer system designed by the popular arcade game publisher Midway. It was originally marketed by mail-order catalog for release in 1977, but due to production delays, it was released the following year. The original cost was $299, which is well over $1,300 today adjusted for inflation. The machine was renamed the Bally Professional Arcade by the time it shipped, but it had little retail exposure outside of computer stores. That year, Bally decided to leave the market, and a corporate buyer from Montgomery Ward stepped in and bought the rights to the console and sold it as the Bally Computer System before finally changing its name to the Astrocade in 1982. The Astrocade is mostly known for its very powerful graphics for the time. It had a 1.7 MHz CPU, up to 64 KB of RAM with upgradable modules, 8 kilobytes of ROM, and up to a 320 by 204 screen resolution in 8 colors with the installed RAM add-ons. The Astrocade was one of the first cartridge-based consoles, and its games were known as videocades. The system also included 2 games built into the console itself, Gunfight and Checkmate, along with a calculator and a doodle program called Scribbling. Most cartridges included 2 games, and when they were inserted into the machine, it would boot to a menu listing the programs on the cartridge first, and then the 4 built-in programs. On the front of the unit was a 24-key hexpad keyboard used for selecting games and options, as well as operating the calculator. On the back were a number of ports, including connectors for power, controller ports supporting up to 4 controllers, and an expansion port. On the top rear of the unit was an empty space that could be opened to store up to 15 game cartridges. There were a total of 28 games released for the Astrocade, including many popular arcade classics like Space Invaders, Galaxia, Seawolf, and Grand Prix Demolition Derby. When purchased in 1981, the Astrocade also included a basic programming language cartridge so that the user could use a simple line editor to program in the basic language. Programs were entered via the calculator keypad with a plastic overlay displaying letters, symbols, and basic keywords. These were selected through a set of 4 colored shift keys on the keyboard. One available peripheral was the Z-Grass unit that sat under the Astrocade and turned it into a real computer, including a full keyboard, a math coprocessor, 32 kilobytes of RAM, and a new 32 kilobyte ROM containing the Grass programming language. The unit also added I/O ports for a cassette and floppy disk, allowing it to be used with CP/M, which is a DOS-style operating system at the time. The Astrocade was a pretty successful system, but the video game crash of 1983 brought an end to this area of video game consoles, and the company discontinued production later that year. While the Astrocade was being produced in the US in 1977, a new company from Japan was getting into the home video game market, and their name is Nintendo. The Color TV game is the first video game console ever made by Nintendo. The system was released as a series of 5 dedicated game consoles between 1977 and 1980 and available only in Japan. By the late 1970s, Nintendo began moving away from toys and playing cards and into the rapidly growing video game market. This decision was based on the smash success of the arcade game Space Invaders in 1978. Nintendo had no prior experience in manufacturing electronics and had previously contracted Mitsubishi for production of EVR Race, which was a very large arcade machine, so they decided to work with them again for the Color TV game. For the first 2 consoles, Color TV Game 6 and Color TV Game 15, Nintendo acquired a license from Magnavox to produce its own Pong clone game consoles. The Color TV Game 6 was launched on June 1st, 1977. It retailed at a price of 9,800 yen, or about $360 today, which was much lower than competing systems, and Nintendo used this as their marketing tool. It contains 6 variations of Pong, such as adding additional paddles, decreasing the size of the paddles, and adding deflecting shields in the center of the screen. It can be powered by batteries or by a power adapter sold separately. 2 weeks later, Nintendo released an improved version of the TV Game 6 featuring a cream white outer casing and removed the power adapter. A second variation was produced as part of a promotion with company House Foods to promote its House Shanman instant noodles. It's identical to the original TV Game 6 but has the House Shanman logo on the casing. This version was produced in limited quantities, making it incredibly rare today. Sharp Electronics also produced a dark orange colored version of the TV Game 6 to bundle with its television sets. 1 week after the release of the TV Game 6, on June 8th, Nintendo released the Color TV Game 15. It retailed for 15,000 yen or about $540. In reality, the TV Game 15 is a re-release of the TV Game 6, only it has 15 games. The TV Game 15 has detachable controllers which are stored in a small compartment on the system. Nintendo produced a second model of the TV Game 15 with a reddish-orange casing, which had a longer production run and are more common today. Sharp also made a white-colored version that was renamed Color TV Game XG115 and is quite rare. The third version, the Color TV Game Racing 112, was released a year later in June of 1978 and is significantly larger than the previous 2 consoles. The built-in game is a top-down racer similar to Speed Race, which was an arcade game of the era. The console comes with 2 paddle controllers for multiplayer support, and the name came from the 112 possible game combinations. Color TV Game Block Kazushi was released the next year in April of 1979 at 13,500 yen. This version of the system was produced by Nintendo themselves, allowing its name to be displayed directly on the console. Block Kazushi includes 6 cloned variations of Breakout, which was an arcade game released in America by Atari. The system's casing was designed by Mario creator Shigeru Miyamoto and was one of his very first designs with the company. The final console, the computer TV game, was released in 1980. Because dedicated game consoles were decreasing in popularity, the computer TV game was only produced in limited quantities, making it incredibly rare today. Miyamoto again designed the system's white-colored casing and the packaging. The Color TV game series was very successful for Nintendo and it was a commercial hit. In 1983, they stopped production of the Color TV game, having sold well over 30 million units in total. This allowed them to concentrate on the next generation of video game consoles, the Family Computer, which became the Nintendo Entertainment System in the US. Widely considered one of the greatest video game systems of all time, the NES would not exist today had it not been for the success of the Color TV game. Another Japanese company seeking to compete with Nintendo in 1977 was Takatoku, designing Japan's first ever cartridge-based console, the videocassette Rock. In 1977, the video game industry in Japan was not very developed. A few Pong-type consoles existed, but none of the more modern cartridge-based consoles such as the Fairchild Channel F and the RCA Studio 2 had made it to Japan yet. Takatoku, a toy maker in Japan, wanted to release a system to compete with Nintendo and Bandai. At the time, General Instruments had just released the Gemini 8600 concept, which allowed companies to release a cheap cartridge-based video game console using parts provided by General Instruments themselves. Takatoku saw an opportunity to be the first to market a system based on this technology in Japan. Released in October of 1977 as the Takatoku Videocassette Rock Service Set, it became the first cartridge-based video game console ever made in Japan. The service set has paddles and came with 6 ball game cartridges and was sold for 13,800 yen, which is about $500 today converted and adjusted for inflation. 2 months later in December, Takatoku released the Basic Set, which switched the paddles for joysticks and came with the 8-ball game cartridge. The Basic Set was the most expensive version, selling for 17,500 yen or about $650 today, and it was also possible to purchase the console itself with no game cartridges for 9,800 yen or about $375 today. There were 7 games in total made for the system, including a tank game, car race, stunt rider, and 2 audio synthesizer cartridges. The videocassette Rock never really caught on due to the competition of the Nintendo Color TV games and the Bandai TV Jack consoles, making it very rare and sought after by collectors today. Heading back to the US to one of the very first American-made cartridge-based home video game consoles, it's the APF MP1000. The APF microcomputer system is a second-generation 8-bit cartridge-based video game console released in October of 1987 by APF Electronics. The console is often referred to as the M1000 or the MP1000, which are the 2 model numbers of the console. It sold for $129, which is a little over $550 today adjusted for inflation. The MP1000 is a successor to the APF TV Fun line of first-generation consoles, which were Pong-style game systems very similar to the Coleco Telstar, having 4 simple games built into the unit. It was an 8-bit system and the only second-generation console to use the Motorola 68000 CPU. Running at 0.895 MHz with 1 KB of RAM and up to a 256 by 192 screen resolution in 4 colors or 128 by 192 in 8 colors. The APF MP1000 comes built in with the game Rocket Patrol, and there are a total of 13 games produced for the system. Some of these titles include Baseball, Blackjack, and Space Destroyers. Hearing that Atari was developing a computer add-on for the 2600, APF designed a peripheral called the Imagination Machine, which was a docking station allowing the user to attach the game console to, turning it into a full-fledged home computer. It had a built-in keyboard and cassette player and could attach to a floppy disk drive and a modem. The Imagination Machine alone sold for $599 in 1979, which is well over $2,500 today adjusted for inflation. But unfortunately, the Imagination Machine couldn't save the company. APF had spent a lot of money in developing the MP1000 and the Imagination Machine, and by 1981 had more than $7 million in debt. The video game industry was failing, and the bank asked APF to concentrate on their line of calculators, which was still successful, in order to pay back their loans. The APF management refused to change their business strategy and gave the company to the bank under foreclosure, having sold just over 50,000 units of the system before being discontinued completely after only 4 years of production. As APF Electronics was leaving the game console market in the early 1980s, electronics giant Casio was entering it, their first console ever, the PV-1000. The PV-1000 is a third-generation home video game console manufactured by Casio and released in Japan in 1983. In the early 1980s, Casio was one of the most respected brands in electronics, and based on their success, they decided to extend their reach and release two other devices to appeal to gamers: the PV-1000, a dedicated video game system, and the PV-2000, a computer loosely based on the MSX system. The PV-1000 was released in October of 1983, priced at 14,800 yen, which is about $325 today converted and adjusted for inflation. The Nintendo Famicom was very popular at the time and was out of stock in many stores. Casio hoped to capitalize on that and offer an alternative game console. The PV-1000 is powered by a Xilong Z80 CPU and had 2 KB of RAM, with 1 KB allocated as VRAM. It had a 256 by 192 screen resolution with 8 colors. There were only 13 games developed for the system, some of which include Dig Dug, Turpin, Super Cobra, and Space Panic. It had a joystick-style controller with a start, select, and trigger button. Casio failed to achieve significant sales numbers. The exact reason for the failure of the console is unknown, but many factors may have played a role in its demise, including poor marketing and the confusion created by the PV-2000 computer that also uses cartridges but that were incompatible with the PV-1000s. Nevertheless, after a few weeks on store shelves, the PV-1000 was discontinued, making this console extremely rare today. Now let's move forward a few years to the mid-1980s to Worlds of Wonder's shooting-based video game system, the Action Max. The Action Max is a home video game console using VHS tapes for games. It was manufactured in 1987 by Worlds of Wonder and initially sold for $99, which is about $250 today adjusted for inflation. It was released mostly in North America, with a few consoles having been shipped to Europe. The Action Max required the player to have a VCR to be able to play its games. VHS tapes are used to play a short movie. Whenever something targetable would come up on the screen, players shoot at the television and a sensor would pick up the signal from the light gun. The gaming is strictly point-based and not dependent on shot accuracy, and as a result, players can't really win or lose the game. The system's appeal was limited by this and the fact that the only real genre of games for the system were light gun games, and the games played out the exact same way every time you played, leading to its quick market decline, with only 5 games being produced for the system. By September of 1987, the company was in deep financial trouble with nearly $240 million in debt, and by December of that year, they fired nearly half of their employees. By 1988, the company filed for bankruptcy and was liquidated later that year. The creditors continued to operate the company to recoup their losses until finally closing its doors in late 1990. The Action Max was seen as a commercial failure, and it's pretty rare to find today, although not really desired by collectors. As the Action Max was leaving the market, the VTech company was just entering it with their educational game console, the Socrates. The VTech Socrates is an 8-bit educational video game console released in 1988 at a cost of $130, which is about $325 today adjusted for inflation. The console features a robot character called Socrates, named after the philosopher, that's very similar to the Johnny Five robot from the Short Circuit movies. The system was pretty expensive when it was released, and the cost put it at odds with other educational toys, and even VTech's own products like the WizKid systems. The Socrates was released just as the third generation of video game consoles like Sega Genesis and the NES were on the way out. The system includes a full keyboard, which was wireless, and 2 wired controllers, but consoles vary in their effectiveness in receiving the signals. Some can receive signals from up to 12 feet away, while others require the player to be almost directly in front of the receiver. The mouse and touchpad peripherals used for the CAD Professor and touchpad cartridges also use infrared signals, and similar issues caused many problems with them. The Socrates system is bundled with games in 5 categories: math problems, word games, music games, and Super Painter. Additional games for the system were packaged as cartridges, which resemble 3.5-inch floppy disks, and there were 9 of these games in total. The Yeno company also distributed the game in Europe. In Germany, under the name Professor Weiss Als, which translates to Professor Knows Everything, and in France as the Professor Sci2, Jeu Educaf Video, where Sci2 comes from the French phrase meaning knows all. VTech also distributed the system in Canada, being sold as the Socrates Sci2, Jeu Educaf Video. Because of the Socrates' high cost and limited game library, it quickly became obsolete among other educational consoles. The system itself was slow and made learning with the games uninteresting. After only a few years of production, it was discontinued in the early 1990s. While the Socrates turned out to be a failure, the next console on our list was far from it. Being a huge success in South Korea, it's the Daewoo Zemix. The Zemix is the first video game console made by Daewoo Electronics in Korea and was first released in 1985. The name Zemix means it's fun in Korean, and the console was not sold outside of South Korea. It originally sold for $199, which is about $550 today adjusted for inflation. The Zemix is essentially an MSX home computer refitted into a home console-like shell, and because of that, many of the games released for it are also compatible with the MSX computer. There are at least 30 known games for the Zemix, which are mostly MSX titles released in cartridge format for the console, although some of the consoles used the CD-ROM format to play MSX games directly. The Zemix was manufactured and sold in a wide variety of designs other than the standard model. Some of these include the Zemix 50 series that came in pink and white, pink and blue, and yellow and blue. The Zemix Victory, which came in a variety of colorways including black and red, white and gray, and black with yellow and blue. The Zemix Super Victory, which was a simpler design with just a cartridge slot and a power button, available in black and red, and pink and white. And the Zemix Turbo, which had a robotic spaceship design and is incredibly rare and hard to find today. There were a number of peripherals made by both Daewoo and Zemina for the Zemix, including joysticks, keyboards, RAM expansion cards, a music box, and a family card that allowed you to play Nintendo Famicom games on the Zemix console due to the fact that there were no copyright laws in Korea at the time. Then there was the Zemix Kobo, that included a monitor, a storage tray for games, and this very strange console layout with built-in keyboards and symmetrical buttons for 2 players. Incredibly, the Zemix was produced for over 10 years until it was finally discontinued in 1995. Moving on from the success of the Zemix to another failure of a game console, we head back to the US for a look at the Hyperscan. The Hyperscan is a home video game console from the toy company Mattel, first released in October of 2006 at a price of $69.99, which is just over $100 today adjusted for inflation. The Hyperscan was Mattel's second video game console after the Intellivision released way back in 1979. Released a few weeks before the Sony PlayStation 3 and during the domination of the Nintendo Wii, Mattel tried to ride the wave of the collectible trading card industry. With the success of the Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon trading card games, Mattel wanted to appeal to this generation and had the licenses to do so. Mattel had the ability to make an affordable system that would bridge video games and card collecting. The idea was simple, to use RFID technology embedded in each trading card to affect the games. The console came with the X-Men fighting game on a CD and 1 controller. 2 other games were also available at launch, Ben 10 and Interstellar Wrestling League, both priced at $20. Additional cards for each game were available in a booster pack of 6 cards each for $10. Marvel Heroes, the 4th game of the console, was released in November of 2006, followed by Spider-Man, which was exclusively released at Toys R Us, and those were the only 5 games made for the system. The console was universally criticized for its clunky design, broken controls, poor game library, long loading screen, and the unnecessary need for playing cards to select characters, forcing kids to buy booster packs in hope of finding characters to play in the game. The games felt rushed and had problems varying from having major slowdowns to being literally unplayable. The graphics were very outdated by the time it was released, but players might have been able to overlook this if the gameplay was good, which it wasn't. It wasn't long before the consoles were sold at a clearance price of only $9.99, while the games were sold for $1.99 and booster packs for 99 cents. PC World magazine named the Hyperscan one of the top 10 worst video game systems of all time. It was finally discontinued in 2007, less than a year after its release, selling fewer than 10,000 consoles in total. And that's it for Tier 8 of the complete video game console iceberg, so let's drop down to Tier 9, starting with one of the very first home video game consoles ever made, the Bandai TV Jack. The Bandai TV Jack 5000 is a first-generation video game console released in 1978. It was sold exclusively in Japan at a cost of 19,800 yen, which is almost $700 US today, converted and adjusted for inflation. The TV Jack 5000 was the 5th system in the TV Jack line of Pong consoles. It was preceded by the TV Jack 1000, then the TV Jack 1500, then the 2500, and then the 3000, all of which were more traditional Pong consoles not using cartridges but having games built into the system. Like the Takatoku videocassette Rock we talked about in Tier 8, the TV Jack 5000 was built using the Gemini 6800 concept, which was purchased from General Instruments. This system allows manufacturers to purchase all of the components needed to build a game console, including the logic board complete with chips and even the game cartridge boards, and then design their shell around it, creating a console of their own, and many consoles of the era were made using the same technology. There were 4 variations of the TV Jack 5000 produced over the course of its 2-year lifespan, including a beige console, a blue console, and 2 yellow versions, one with an eject button and one without. Each version of the console came with different games built into the system. 6 cartridge games are believed to have been released for the system, including Road Race, Wipeout, and sports games. But games from other consoles such as the Hanimex SD50 and others also work with the TV Jack 5000 due to them all having the same General Instruments components. There are 2 controllers hardwired into the system, and each has a joystick and 1 button. When not in use, the controllers snap into the top of the console for storage. After only 2 years of production, Bandai abandoned the TV Jack 5000 to concentrate its efforts on its next system. It's estimated that fewer than 30,000 consoles were ever produced, making it very rare and very expensive to collect today. So let's just get right into the next console produced by Bandai, the Supervision 8000. The Bandai Supervision 8000, sometimes referred to as the TV Jack 8000, is a second-generation home video game console and the successor to the TV Jack 5000. It was released in 1979 at a cost of 60,000 yen, which is an incredible 1,800 US dollars today, converted and adjusted for inflation. This system was the last of the Bandai TV Jack console lineup, but was completely different from the other consoles of the series. The Supervision 8000 had a central CPU, while the other consoles that belonged to the first generation didn't. They didn't feature a microprocessor and instead used logic board circuits to produce Pong-style games. The Supervision 8000 had an 8-bit NEC CPU running at 3.58 MHz and had a 256 by 192 screen resolution and up to 16 colors. The controllers were very similar to the Intellivision, featuring a 12-button keypad, a round directional pad for movement, and 1 side button. There were 7 games released for the system, some of which were Missile Vader, Othello, Submarine, and Beam Galaxian. Although the Supervision 8000 was a decent console, it was very expensive and had few games. Bandai just wasn't getting the sales numbers they needed to keep developing games, and the console was discontinued after only 2 years on the market. In 1980, American company Mattel actually made a deal with Bandai to be the distributor for its Intellivision system in Japan. The 2 consoles are very similar, having a similar design and the same coprocessor, but with different central processors. Due to this licensing agreement between the 2 companies, it's a common misconception that the Supervision 8000 is a clone of the Intellivision, but in fact, the Supervision was actually released first, and Bandai only licensed to sell the Intellivision after its own system had been discontinued. During its short 3-year lifespan, less than 50,000 Supervision 8000 consoles were made, making it incredibly rare today. Keeping things in chronological order, we now move on to the Philips VideoPack G7400. The Philips VideoPack G7400 is a 3rd-generation video game console released in limited quantities in 1983 only in Europe. It is a successor to the VideoPack G7000, which was known as the Magnavox Odyssey 2 in America, and in fact it was planned to be released in the US as the Odyssey 3, but never happened. The system had a 5.91 MHz Intel processor with 6 KB of RAM, 1 KB of ROM, and a 320 by 238 screen resolution, and had excellent graphics compared to other consoles of the era. As I said, there were plans to release the G7400 in the United States as the Odyssey 3 and later as the Odyssey 3 Command Center. The system was actually demonstrated at the 1983 CES show, and some prototypes have been found. However, the Odyssey 3 was never released, mostly because the company thought that it wasn't technologically advanced enough to compete in the marketplace, but then the video game crash of 1983 happened, destroying any chance of it ever being released. There were 15 games produced for the system, some of which included Trans-American Rally, Helicopter Rescue, Air Battle, and Freedom Fighter. Not only did the G7400 have its own library of games, but it could also play all games from the previous G7000 console. There were 3 expansion modules produced for the system: the C7010 chess module that increased the G7400's computing power so that it could play chess, the Voice, which was a speech synthesis unit, also compatible with the G7000, and the G7420 home computer module, which was a Microsoft Basic module converting the G7400 into a real computer, adding an additional Z80 CPU with 16 KB of RAM and 16 KB of ROM. Exact production numbers of the G7400 are unknown, but very few were made. After only 1 year of production leading up to the video game crash of 1983, the system was discontinued, making it very rare and very hard to find today. Another console released at the time in 1983, but in Japan, was the Nichibutsu MyVision. The MyVision is a home video game console developed by Nichibutsu and released in Japan in 1983 at a price of 40,000 yen, which is over $900 today, converted and adjusted for inflation. The system was dedicated solely to playing video versions of popular board games. A total of 6 games were released for the system, each being sold for 4,500 yen. Some of these titles were Reversi, Mahjong, and Mastermind. There was no controller for the system. Instead, the player used the keypad located on the top of the system. The only way to play a game in 2-player mode was to have a second MyVision console and use a link cable that would connect through a communication port on the back of the system. The console struggled to maintain sales when it was released, mostly due to the fact that it cost 40,000 yen when the Epoch cassette vision could be bought for only 14,000 yen, plus the fact that its games were very basic puzzle and board games. Then to make matters even worse for the MyVision, later the same year it was released, Nintendo released the Famicom system and Sega released the SG-1000, both of which were less than half the price. This removed any chance of the inferior MyVision console having success in the video game market, and it was quickly discontinued. Total sales numbers are unknown, but there were very few consoles sold, making it very rare and hard to find today. Another console released at the same time in 1983 exclusively in Japan was the Compact Vision TV Boy. The Compact Vision TV Boy is the second-generation video game console developed by Gakken and released in Japan in 1983 for a price of 8,800 yen, which is about $200 today, converted and adjusted for inflation. The console was made to compete with the Epoch cassette vision, which had 70% of the video game market in Japan at the time. The TV Boy was an 8-bit system and had a 4 MHz Motorola processor that was built into its cartridges. The system had 2 KB of RAM and a 128 by 192 screen resolution in 4 colors. There were only 6 games made for the system, each being sold for 3,800 yen. Some of these titles included Robotan Wars, Mr. Bomb, Frogger, and Excite Invader. All the games for the console were single player only. This was due to the strange form factor of the console. On the left side was a handle that the user would grip onto, and it had one button. Then on the right side was a T-handled joystick used for movement. The console was released just a few months after the Nintendo Famicom and the Sega SG-1000, which although were more expensive at 15,000 yen, were much more advanced and had more features, as well as a bigger game library. Also, Epoch had just launched the Cassette Vision Junior for only 5,000 yen, which was close to the cost of a single game for the TV Boy. These factors made the system obsolete from the start, and with a high price tag compared to its competition, very few and simple games, and a strange form factor, all led to the system having very poor sales. As a result of this, it is now a very rare collector's item and sought out by many retro game collectors today. Around this same time, a very unique game console was being made in America, and it's called the Vectrex. The Vectrex is a vector display-based home video game console developed by Smith Engineering. It was first released in North America in November of 1982 and then Europe and Japan in 1983. It sold for $199 or about $600 today adjusted for inflation. The Vectrex is unique in that it's the only vector display console ever released for the home market. Vector-based games don't use sprites or pre-designed images like traditional game consoles. Vector-based games use the system's processor to generate lines on the screen. There were many arcade games at the time using this technology, such as Asteroid, Star Trek, Battlezone, and Red Baron. Vector game technology did have both advantages and disadvantages. Being that it didn't use sprites or pictures for its games on screen, there were limitations in the color palette used and there was no shading. But on the other hand, vector graphics didn't lose quality when scaled up or down, so the lines on screen are always crispy and futuristic looking. One thing's for sure, you can immediately spot a vector arcade game when you see it. The Vectrex, unlike other video game systems at the time, didn't need to be hooked up to a television set. It had an integrated monochrome CRT monitor, and a detachable wired controller can be folded into the lower base of the console. Games came with translucent color overlays to place on the screen, and you could purchase accessories like a pair of 3D goggles known as the 3D Imager and a light pen for drawing directly on the screen itself. Initially it did pretty well when it was released, and the board game company Milton Bradley actually bought the company soon after. But unfortunately, due to the video game crash of 1983, sales of the Vectrex plummeted. Milton Bradley cut the cost of the Vectrex in half to try to recover, but it just wasn't enough. And after losing over $30 million on the system, they decided to cut their losses, and it was discontinued the following year in 1984. A few years later, an educational game console was being produced, and it was called the LJN Video Art. The Video Art is an educational video game console that was developed and manufactured by LJN. It was launched in 1987 at a cost of $99, which is about $250 today adjusted for inflation. Its functionality is similar to basic personal computer paint programs. There are two main inputs on the system's controller, a joystick controlling a cursor to draw lines and curves, and a slider to select up to 16 colors. Turning on the console without a cartridge inserted into the system gives you a blank screen for drawing. There were only 9 games made for the system, and some of them include popular franchises like Looney Tunes, Marvel Superheroes, Disney Coloring Book, and A Trip to the Zoo. In 1987, LJN spent most of its $5 million TV and print advertising budget on a run of TV commercials, including a rap-style beat saying,
"Then my mom, she got smart. She got me video art."
In 1987, to try to boost sales, Toys R Us claimed that the Video Art was among its hot toys for Christmas, alongside the NES and talking dolls such as Cabbage Patch Kids. But the console was mostly hated by critics, and USA Today put it on its list of toys that deserve to be dumped, calling the Video Art an expensive etch-a-sketch for your TV that's much harder to use and not much fun. And the results don't look nearly as good as those shown on the TV ads. The Video Art was one of the less successful interactive video game consoles compared to the ViewMaster Interactive Vision and Video Smarts. It was discontinued in late 1989 at a heavy price drop and is considered a commercial failure. It's LJN's first, last, and only video game console they ever made. Jumping forward to a more modern console and rounding out Tier 9 is a very unique system designed for South America, and it's called the Zibo. Zibo is a 7th generation video game console released only in Brazil and Mexico in 2009. It originally sold for 500 Brazilian reals, which is about $180 today converted and adjusted for inflation. After only a few months on the market, the price was dropped to 400 real and then only 300. The Zibo was unique in that it was 3G enabled. The company made a deal with AT&T, and the console had a cell phone style SIM card so it could connect to the internet without the need for a modem or home internet. This was due to limited internet access in many urban areas in Brazil and Mexico. Amazingly, there was no monthly fee for internet access, and it was included in the purchase of the console as long as you owned it. The user only needed to purchase the actual games themselves. The Zibo doesn't use DVDs or cartridges. Games and other content are downloaded wirelessly over broadband cellular networks. In addition to games, the Zibo also provides internet connectivity, enabling users to access educational and information content, communicate via email, and do social networking all on the console itself. The system had 1 GB of internal storage for games and an SD slot for expansion. The Zibo came with a standard Z-Pad controller that had 7 buttons, a directional pad, and 2 analog sticks. Other accessories available were the Boomerang, which was a wireless controller with a built-in accelerometer using motion sensing technology very similar to the Wii. A wireless keyboard was also available for use with the web browsing app, email, and social media. There were over 50 games made for the Zibo, many of which were remakes of mobile phone games like Resident Evil 4, Crash Bandicoot Nitro Kart 3D, FIFA 2009, and Rally Master Pro. There were also original games made for the Zibo designed to use the motion sensing controller like Boomerang Sports, Football Club, and Zibo Extreme. The Brazilian version of the console came with 3 free games pre-installed, while the Mexican version came with 5. Even though it was fairly successful, in May of 2011, Zibo announced it would end production of the system to work on other projects. The ZiboNet 3G network would remain active for another 6 months until September, when it would be shut down permanently. An estimated 30,000 consoles were sold during its short 3-year run, and luckily, the system uses the Brew platform, so using the Zibo SDK, people are still porting games for the system to this day. And that's it for Tier 9 of the complete video game console Iceberg. So let's just get right into it and take a deep dive into Tier 10, starting with one from Nintendo that you probably didn't even know existed. The iQ Player is a home video game console released in 2003 by iQ in a partnership with Nintendo. It sold for 499 Chinese yuan, which is about $120 today converted and adjusted for inflation. In China, it's called Shen which translates to Divine Gaming Machine. This console was never released in English-speaking countries, but the name iQ Player is visible in the instruction manual. China has a large black market for video games, and usually only a few consoles officially make it to the Chinese market. Many Chinese gamers tend to purchase pirated cartridges or disc copies, or download copied game files and play them with an emulator. Nintendo wanted to stop software piracy in China and bypass the ban that the Chinese government had placed on home video game consoles since 2000. Basically, Nintendo was trying to deal with the clone console problem in China, so they came up with the genius idea of cloning their own console. The iQ player is constructed with the same logic as N64DD or Stellaview, where the games are stored on 64 megabyte flash cards. The 64 megabyte flash card is contained within a cartridge that plugs directly into the console itself, which doubles as a controller. The controller features an analog thumbstick and a directional pad on the left side, a power and start button in the center, and 6 face buttons on the right side, which include the traditional Nintendo A and B buttons, as well as 4 directional buttons labeled C. This lesser-known Nintendo console has 14 games, all of which were previously published by Nintendo in other countries. The list of classic game titles include Mario 64, F-Zero, Super Smash Bros., and Mario Kart 64. Games were purchased at a special iQ depot where the games could be downloaded onto the cartridges and played later. Although in contrast with N64, the iQ player uses system-on-a-chip technology in order to reduce the size. There is no difference between the N64 version and the iQ version of these games except for the fact that text and in some cases voices have been translated to Chinese. However, being that the iQ games are newer than the N64 counterparts, many of the glitches and errors from the original games have been fixed. Some extra features with the iQ player include the option for parental controls by setting an age limit. Also, there's the possibility to set the console's real-time counter, which gives the option to put playtime limits on the system. All of those features are enabled by a 4-digit password that can be enabled by the parent and would be required by the player to access the game menu each time the unit was turned on. After being produced for 13 years, the iQ was finally discontinued in 2016, having sold an estimated 12,000 consoles. The iQ at-home service remained active for another 2 years until it was finally put offline in 2018, and the best-selling game for the system was Dr. Mario. Our next console has a unique feature, and that is actually 2 game systems built into one. Aptly named, it's the Dyna 2-in-1. The Dyna 2-in-1 is a video game console made by the Taiwanese company Bit Corporation and was released in 1986. It was later brought to the United States by the Telegames Company and released as a Telegames Personal Arcade at a cost of only $40, which is just over $100 today. The Dyna 2-in-1 was unique in that it had 2 cartridge slots. One was made to accept cartridges from the original ColecoVision console, while the other was made to play Sega SG-1000 games. This hybrid system was possible due to the fact that the ColecoVision and Sega SG-1000 have nearly identical hardware. The 2 consoles share the same CPU, VDP, and sound chip. The controllers have very similar layout to the classic Nintendo controllers, featuring a directional pad and 2 face buttons. The console, however, is not compatible with all ColecoVision cartridges, partly from its lack of a secondary numeric keypad. Any ColecoVision game that requires 2 keypads can't be used. A difference in the Dyna's controller wiring prevents the use of Coleco's roller controller and super action controllers, and games dependent on either one aren't compatible. Expansion modules for the ColecoVision are also incompatible, as the expansion port uses the pin configuration of the Sega SG-1000, so ColecoVision games that rely on expansion modules also can't be used. The Dyna is, however, compatible with the SG-1000 keyboard. The Telegames Personal Arcade was only advertised as an alternative to the ColecoVision, leaving the function of the Sega SG-1000 cartridge port unmentioned in advertising due to fear of being sued for trademark and copyright infringement. After all, they didn't receive any permission to license this feature. Despite this legal loophole, all Sega SG-1000 games are completely functional. The console does not have a port for the Sega MyCard games, but the Sega Card Catcher peripheral is compatible and allows for Sega MyCard games to be played on the system. By the time the Dyna was released in 1986, the Nintendo Entertainment System, a system vastly superior to both the Sega SG-1000 and ColecoVision, had already been released in North America. The Dyna had very little appeal except for its low price point. The system was sold by mail order only, and little to no advertisement was done around the launch of the console. To keep the cost down, the box didn't even include the required 12-volt power supply, the RF selection box, or any instructions. The console worked on channel 13, which is counterintuitive in North America, being that most systems ran on channel 3 or 4, especially when you don't have any instructions to figure that out. Another problem was the usefulness of the console. The ColecoVision was discontinued in 1985, but could still be purchased for less than the cost of the Dyna 2-in-1. And the Dyna wasn't fully compatible with all of its games, so there wasn't really any benefit to choosing the Dyna over the original ColecoVision. Then, since the SG-1000 compatibility was a hidden feature, the only advantage this system had over the ColecoVision wasn't even known to anyone who was considering buying it. In all fairness, even if the feature would have been marketed, it probably would have very little effect on sales because it was almost impossible to buy Sega SG-1000 games in the US since they were never released in North America. Very few Dyna 2-in-1 consoles were sold and it was discontinued in 1994, mostly due to its mail-order only marketing and the fact that a tornado ripped through the Telegames factory, wiping out the warehouse and all of its remaining stock. The system is very rare and hard to find today. While the Dyna 2-in-1 wasn't officially licensed by Sega, the next console on the list was, and it was the Sega Family Driver. The Sega Family Driver, also called the Video Driver in North America, is a VHS-based video game system designed to play racing games. It was released in 1988 by the Sega Corporation in Japan at a cost of 8,800 yen, which is about $165 today converted and adjusted for inflation. The console is made of a steering wheel and a sensor that was attached to a television. On top of the sensor sits a plastic car that is controlled electronically by the steering wheel. The system uses VHS tapes instead of game cartridges. The objective of the game was to follow the course of the road to maximize your score. The scoreboard started from 100 points. If your plastic car drifted off the road and hit an obstacle, you'd see flashing lights, sound, and your score would drop by 1 point. The goal of the game was to finish the race with all 100 points. Only 3 games were released for the system in Japan. Halahara Touring 1 was included with the system, while Seaside Drive and I Am a Patrol were both sold separately for 1,900 yen. In North America, only 2 games were ever released. California Chase was the first game and it was bundled with the console. Road Race was later released alongside California Chase in a single VHS tape and became the new pack-in game for the system. In Europe, the same 2 games as North America were released but with slightly different names. California Chase was released as Police Pursuit, and Road Race was changed to Road Racer. The games were sold separately and were not bundled on the same VHS tape as they were in North America. The Sega Video Driver didn't sell well at all. The games that were released provided a very linear and boring experience, which was limited by the capabilities of the VHS tapes. The Video Driver was very unpopular among gamers and was discontinued shortly after release, with total sales numbers unknown. The next console on our list was designed with playing card games in mind, and it's called the Champion 2711. The Champion 2711 is a video game console released by Unisonic in 1978 in the US at a cost of $150, which is about $680 today, adjusted for inflation. The console was also released in Japan the following year as a Unisonic Casino TV game. Like dozens of other manufacturers of consumer electronics, Unisonic released a series of dedicated consoles in the late 1970s. The consoles were generally built around Pong, a game console released by Atari in 1975. And Unisonic released its first version of the game in 1976, named the Unisonic Sportsman T101. In 1978, the company released its last Pong console, the Olympian 2600, which featured 10 games and substituted joysticks for the paddle controllers and light gun, before finally releasing the Champion 2711 later that year. The Champion 2711 is the only product known to be based on the Gemini mid-range 8950 chip designed by General Instruments. Like the Mattel Intellivision, which is based on the more powerful General Instruments Gemini full-range 8900 chip, the Champion 2711 is built around the same 16-bit CPU. However, the mid-range chipset makes use of a simple combined display and sound chip, which can only generate white text and colored playing card symbols on a green playing field. Because of this chip, the Unisonic Champion 2711 was limited to text and playing card graphics. The system output at a resolution of 213 by 132 in 4 colors of white, black, green, and red, and could only generate simple audio tones. The console contains 2 built-in games, Blackjack and Baccarat, and 4 more cartridges were released for the system. 3 of these cartridges contain additional card games, including variations of Poker, Mastermind, and Concentration. The 4th cartridge is an edutainment title called Arithmetic Primer. This system represents a transitional time in the development of video game consoles and shows the struggles of attempting to transition from production of dedicated Pong consoles to early cartridge-based systems. As a consequence of its commercial failure and limited production run, the Champion 2711 is now very rare. It's estimated that only around 500 consoles were ever produced, and collectors have only been able to confirm the existence of 13 of them to this day. So while being considered one of the worst consoles ever made, due to its rarity, they are very valuable today. Moving on to what might be one of the most family-friendly video game consoles ever made, let's talk about the Zap-It GameWave. The GameWave Family Entertainment System, commonly abbreviated as GameWave, is a hybrid DVD player and home video game console manufactured by Zappit Games. It was first released in 2005 in Canada and the US at a cost of $99, which is about $150 today adjusted for inflation. The console itself is little more than a standard progressive scan DVD player. Half of the console, and part that makes up the wave in the name GameWave, is just a covered storage unit for the controllers. The console was originally packed with the game 4 Degrees, The Ark of Trivia, and was later replaced with VeggieTales Veg Out. Because of the use of family-friendly games and a partnership with VeggieTales, the system found some success with Christian households. The controller has 4 directional buttons used for menu navigation and DVD playback controls. It has 4 alphanumeric buttons along the top labeled A, B, C, and D, designed primarily for selecting responses in trivia games. A numeric pad is also at the bottom of the controller with a menu and setup buttons. The controller came in 6 colors. Blue, yellow, green, and red came packaged with the console, and purple and orange controllers could be purchased separately for $30. Each controller color has a different infrared frequency, allowing the console to tell different controllers apart from each other for multiplayer games. Due to the shape of the controller and its marketing as a family-friendly entertainment system, no heavily action-based games were ever made for the console's 13-game library. Instead, games consisting mainly of trivia games and puzzle games were produced. Unfortunately, even with its family-friendly marketing, the GameWave didn't generate enough interest in the Christian community to be financially viable. In a last-ditch effort, Zappit did relaunch the console and reduce the price from $100 to $80, but it was too little too late. By 2009, the company had invested $25 million in the GameWave project and was out of cash and was forced to declare bankruptcy. An estimated 70,000 GameWave consoles were produced in its 4-year lifespan. A company that's no stranger to the Iceberg is VTech, and the next console on the list is called the V-Flash. The VTech V-Flash, known as V-Smile Pro in Europe, is a 7th generation 32-bit console released in 2006. The system retailed for $100, which is about $150 today adjusted for inflation. The V-Flash is a successor to the V-Smile systems and aimed at children from the ages of 6 to 10. This console is the most powerful and advanced VTech console ever made, capable of playing games with 3D graphics similar to the Sega Saturn. But since it didn't sell too well, not many games were ever produced for it. The console itself has a gray and blue color scheme and a front panel with a curvy style to it that somewhat resembles a small DVD player or set-top DVR box. On top of the unit, the right side has a pop-open door that provides access to the CD disk drive. In Europe, the V-Smile Pro had a clear orange piece on the tray and had orange feet. The controller is similar to traditional gamepad controllers found on earlier systems, having a directional pad, start button, and 4 face buttons. There are only 10 game titles known to have been made for the system, all of which are licensed from popular franchises. Some of its games include SpongeBob SquarePants, Scooby-Doo, Disney Princess, Spider-Man, and Cars. Unlike most other CD-ROM based consoles, this system uses CDs enclosed in a plastic case to protect the disc from being damaged by children. But being that the discs use the ISO 9660 file system without any copy protection, you can play pirated games with an empty disc caddy that actually came with the system to play audio CDs. Or you can just trick the console into playing a regular CD by pressing the button in the disc tray, which would normally be pressed by having a V-disc inside the console. Overall, the console was a commercial failure, primarily due to the fact that although its games were marketed towards young children, they found the 3D gameplay hard to adapt to, and older children weren't interested in playing the small library of childish games. So after being on the market for less than 2 years, the V-Flash was discontinued in 2007. Now back to the list for another console, this time from Germany. It's the SHG Blackpoint. The SHG Blackpoint, also known simply as the Blackpoint, is a second-generation video game console that was released in 1982 by this company, which I won't even attempt to pronounce the name of, which is simply known as SHG for short. It was released only in Germany at a cost of 168 Deutschmarks, which was about $75 US at the time, or about $230 today converted and adjusted for inflation. The system came with 2 detachable game controllers, each having 1 analog joystick and 1 fire button. On the console, there were 10 buttons to select game modes, and games came on ROM cartridges. There's also a difficulty switch, an on-off switch, and a start button on the console itself. There were two models of the system produced, the FS1003 and the FS2000, and the console itself did not contain any CPU or RAM, and instead they were built into the cartridges themselves. There are only 7 or 8 games officially known to have been released for the system, which include a shooting game, a naval war simulator, and racing games. There was also a tank battle game that came with 2 digital controllers that were required to play. The games were sold for around 50 to 80 Deutschmarks, which was about $20 to $30 each. Like the Palladium Telecassetten game and many other second generation consoles, the SHG Blackpoint uses PC50X cartridges. The cartridges are also compatible with the Audiosonic programmable video system and the Hanimex HMG 1292 home video game console we talked about in earlier tiers. While this console was primarily only sold in Germany, they were made in fairly large quantities, so while total sales numbers are unknown, they can still be found pretty easily all over Europe to this day. Another game system very similar to the Blackpoint but made a few years earlier is the Palladium Telecassetten game. The Palladium Telecassetten game is a home video game console that was released in 1978 only in Germany. Palladium is the subdivision of the mail-order company Neckermann Technologies in Germany, and the console sold for $99, which is about $450 today adjusted for inflation. The console features a black housing with 10 selection switches on it, making it possible to choose between up to 10 different game modes for various games. There were also 3 buttons on the console to change game options, and there are 2 different versions of the console known to exist, the 530 and the 581. The controllers of the 581 model have fire buttons, which are different than the controller of the 530 model. There were many Pong-style predecessors of the Palladium Telecassetten game known to exist, so here's a brief list of some of them. Like the SHG Blackpoint and many other European consoles around the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Palladium Telecassetten game uses PC50X ROM cartridges. The console itself didn't contain a CPU as it was built into the game cartridges themselves. There were 4 games included in the system: Auto Race, Telebowling, 10-ball games, and Motorcycle Race. There were also 7 cartridge games released, and they are all classic games built on General Instruments chips like Cycling, Motorcycle Race, Car Racing, Submarine, and Super Wipeout. These of course are the generic English titles, the real names being in German. Like the SHG Blackpoint, there was also a tank battle cartridge sold that required digital controllers as opposed to the analog joystick controllers that came with the system. In 1982, a successor, the Palladium video computer game, was released, and it's essentially the same system as the Emerson Arcadia 2001, and in fact both consoles are software compatible with each other, so they could technically play each other's games if the cartridge slots were the same, but they aren't. The video computer game came with 2 detachable controllers that featured a screw-on analog joystick and a 16-button keypad. Small plastic overlays were included with each game, explaining the functions of the different keys when placed over the keypads, just like with Mattel's Intellivision. Due to the fact that there were so many different variations of the Palladium game consoles made, exact sales numbers are unknown, but being that they were produced in such large numbers, they can still be found quite easily all across Europe almost 50 years later. The next and final console on the list was manufactured with a very specific purpose in mind, and it's rightfully named the BBC Bridge Companion. The BBC Bridge Companion is exactly what you would think, a game console dedicated to teaching the card game bridge, and this is the only reason that this console was ever produced. It was released in 1985 exclusively in the UK by the British Broadcasting Company and sold for £199, which is about $800 today converted and adjusted for inflation. The console didn't have high sales numbers, but this was to be expected. The Bridge Companion's price was pretty high and it was targeted at a very specific audience. So from that point of view, the console's release was considered a success. The system is powered by a Zilong Z80 8-bit CPU with a Texas Instruments video controller capable of displaying 8 colors and simple beeps for audio. The console didn't have a controller, and instead the buttons were directly on the unit itself, since the system was made with the sole purpose of providing an easy way to play bridge electronically. At the system's launch, only 1 game cartridge was available, while others were in the process of being developed. Gradually, a total of 9 game cartridges were released, each providing an interactive tutorial on various aspects of the game of bridge. Players controlled the action with a gamepad that was integrated into the top of the system. The games were released in a clamshell-style case with a large spiraled notebook for the instruction manual, and for some odd reason, the cartridge slot is located on the back of the system. Although not many consoles were ever sold, the system really didn't fail as it was never really expected to be sold in large quantities. It was aimed at a very limited subset of people, and it did manage to deliver on the expectation of its customers. Being that they were sold in fairly limited numbers, they are a pretty rare system and can be hard to find today. The BBC Bridge Companion is a great little oddity in the history of video game consoles. And that's it, we made it to the bottom of the complete video game console iceberg. If you made it this far, I really do appreciate it, and if you took a second to click the like button, that would be amazing. Let me know in the comments if you had a chance to play any of these consoles and which one of the over 100 systems on the list was your favorite. A lot of work went into this series, and I thank all of you for watching, liking, and leaving positive comments. You can follow me on all social media platforms at IcebergDocs if you want to stay updated and connect with me, and you can now become a channel member on YouTube or a Patreon where you'll get benefits like discounts on merch, video shoutouts, and early access to my docs before they release on YouTube. Again, I thank each and every one of you for your support and for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.